She mopped the same hallway for 6 months. 53 soldiers walked past her every morning. None of them saw her. She was background noise, the woman with the mop, the gray uniform, the downcast eyes. They cracked jokes she pretended not to hear. They left muddy boot prints she cleaned without complaint. They called her Janitor the way people say it when they mean something worse. Then, on a Tuesday in November, a metal clipboard slipped off a wall hook and fell toward the concrete floor, and Ava Carter's left hand shot out and caught it at hip level, without looking up, without breaking her mopping rhythm, without a single wasted motion. The kind of catch that isn't a reflex. The kind that's trained. One instructor saw it. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching her return to work, and felt something cold move through his chest that he couldn't name yet. He would be able to name it later. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The Raven Point Tactical Training Center sat on the edge of a Federal Reserve 18 miles outside the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing and pine trees that swayed in the November wind like they were trying to warn someone. The facility ran 3 overlapping training rotations per year: elite infantry candidates, advanced specialist units, and what the instructors privately called the refinement course, which was military language for taking already excellent soldiers and stress testing them until the cracks showed. The complex smelled like gun oil, sweat, and burnt coffee that nobody ever seemed to finish. The hallways were wide enough for 2 soldiers to pass in full kit, and the lighting was the kind of institutional fluorescent that made everyone look slightly ill. The walls held framed photographs of past commanders, unit citations sealed in laminate, and motivational slogans that had been hung up so long the corners were starting to peel. It was not a glamorous place, but it was a serious one. Ava Carter arrived at 04:45 every morning, before the overnight guard shift handed off to the day rotation, before the first trainees hit the parade ground for PT, before the scent of breakfast from the mess hall had time to drift through the east corridor. She arrived with a wheeled cleaning cart, a gray facility uniform that didn't fit particularly well in the shoulders, and a laminated badge that identified her as contracted maintenance staff. The badge said Ava Carter. Below that it said Facility Services, non-military. That last part was important to a lot of people at Raven Point. It told them exactly how much attention to pay her, which was none. But the east hallway was her first assignment every morning. Long, straight, with scuffed concrete floors that picked up every trace of mud from the training grounds outside. During the rainy stretch in late October, she'd been mopping that hallway 4 times a day. Nobody thanked her. Nobody acknowledged the fact that the floors were clean. They just walked across them and tracked in more mud and kept talking about whatever they'd been talking about before they entered. She didn't mind. Or if she did, she had a way of not showing it that went beyond patience. It was more like absence. Like a part of her had stepped back from the noise of this place and was standing somewhere else, watching through a one-way window, calm and entirely elsewhere. Sergeant First Class Dominic Rael noticed it on his second week at the facility. He was a 12-year infantry veteran with 3 combat deployments and a habit of cataloging everything around him that had been built into him so deep he couldn't turn it off even when he was trying to sleep. He noticed things: threat posture, sight lines, behavioral patterns. He noticed Ava Carter. Not because she stood out. She didn't. That was the thing. She had the profile of someone who had worked very hard to stand out as little as possible. Movement that stayed within expected parameters. Eye contact calibrated to just below the level that would cause people to hold her gaze. A body language built around occupying the minimum amount of space possible. But the balance was wrong. When she moved, she didn't move like a person who had spent years cleaning floors. She moved like someone who had made a decision to move that way. There was a difference. Subtle, the kind of thing that slipped past most people. But it was there if you knew how to look. Her weight distribution was different from civilians. Her footwork when she turned the cart through doorways was economical in a way that suggested spatial awareness trained over years, not just experience with the janitor's cart. Rail filed it away. Said nothing. He'd been wrong about people before. The mess hall gathered its loudest energy between 06:30 and 07:30. When the first training rotation finished PT and came in still carrying the competitive charge of whoever had pushed hardest. The tables filled fast. The noise built in layers, scraping chairs, overlapping conversations, the occasional bark of laughter that cut through everything else. Captain Brooke Mercer held court at the long center table, which was her unofficial throne by virtue of the fact that nobody had ever successfully made her move. She was 34 years old, with a rifle qualification score that was genuinely impressive, and a personality that used that score the way a hammer uses a nail. She had done 2 overseas rotations, made captain in under 10 years, and had a talent for filling the attention of any room she entered. She was also, Rael had decided in his first week, the specific kind of leader who was excellent in controlled environments and who would be a serious problem in any situation that didn't go the way she expected. That morning, Ava was pushing her cart along the wall of the mess hall, collecting a few empty cups in a tray that someone had left on a side counter, when Mercer's table broke into laughter over something that Rael didn't catch the beginning of. "Hey!" Mercer's voice aimed across the room with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to fill the space. "Janitor." Ava paused, turned. Her face was neutral. Not hostile, not eager, just present. "Yes, ma'am." "You ever see a weapon up close?" Mercer gestured vaguely toward the hall that led to the armory wing. "Like a real one?" A ripple of laughter around the table. Someone made a sound that wasn't quite a snicker. "I've seen a few," Ava said. "A few." Mercer's eyebrows went up. She turned to the table. "She's seen a few." More laughter. She looked back at Ava. "You know what kind of training we run here?" "Yes, ma'am." "You watch a lot of movies?" "Not really." "Because that's usually how civilians learn what weapons look like." Another wave of laughter. Mercer was performing now, playing to the crowd, and the crowd was cooperating the way crowds do when someone with authority sets the tone. "Or TV, you watch a lot of TV?" "I read mostly," Ava said. That got a bigger laugh. Someone at the far end of the table said something about reading about combat, and several people thought that was very funny. Ava didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look angry either. She looked, Rael thought, like someone doing a quiet internal calculation, deciding something, filing it under a category she already had a name for. She returned to work. Mercer watched her go, still grinning, and then turned back to her food like she'd already forgotten about it. Rael ate his eggs and said nothing, and kept watching. It escalated the way these things always do when nobody with enough authority decides to stop it. By midweek, the maintenance woman with the gray uniform and the quiet eyes had become informal entertainment for the officers' tier of the facility. Not targeted harassment, nothing that would appear on any report, just the particular cruelty of people with rank and reputation who find someone without either and decide to use them as a mirror to reflect their own importance back at themselves. Lieutenant Gavin Stroud, who managed the armory wing and had a gift for making subordinates feel small that he mistook for leadership, made a habit of stopping her cart in the corridor outside his office. "You know what this is?" He held up a cleaning rod, the kind used for barrel maintenance. "A bore rod," Ava said. Stroud's face shifted. "How do you know that?" "I clean the armory anteroom," she said. "Equipment gets left out." He didn't have a response to that, so he put it back and let her pass, and he stood in the corridor and watched her go with a look on his face that had something uncomfortable in it that he would have been angry if anyone pointed out. That Friday afternoon, Mercer crossed an invisible line that had been moving toward her all week. The East Training Corridor held 4 display mounts, rifles used for educational purposes, each tagged with laminated information cards that most trainees read once and ignored. AR platforms, a bolt-action precision rifle, a short-barreled variant, and a suppressed model that drew more attention than the others. They were secured, cleared, decommissioned for anything beyond display, but they were real weapons, and they looked it. Mercer appeared in this corridor with Stroud and 2 other officers, and a small following of trainees who had materialized the way trainees always do when something entertaining seems to be developing. Ava was working her cart at the far end. "Hey!" Mercer's voice, carrying that particular pitch of authority deployed as amusement. "Janitor." Ava looked up. "Come here, come." She left the cart and walked toward them. Her gait was steady. No hesitation, no visible reluctance. She walked with the same efficiency she used to navigate everything else in this building, like it was simply the next thing to do. "Tell me what these are," Mercer said, gesturing at the display mount. Rael had come in from the side hallway 2 minutes earlier and stopped. He stood near the corner, not close enough to be involved, far enough to watch without being noticed. His instinct told him to stay. Ava looked at the weapons. M4A1 with an ACOG, she said, starting on the left. EO, tech mounted for secondary optic. Looks like there's a PEQ-15 laser designator on the rail. The handguard's been replaced, probably a Geisel. She moved to the next one. Mark 12 SPR. Mod 1 configuration based on the free float tube length. Heavy barrel, Harris bipod, suppressor-ready muzzle device. I'd guess this was used for designated marksman qualification at some point. The bolt action. Remington 700 chassis system. Probably the military version. Looks like a Schmidt and Bender scope. If that's the PM2, it's a serious piece of glass. The turrets have been adjusted. She looked at the final one. Heckler & Koch, HK416, 11-inch barrel. That suppressor's a Surefire SOCOM, or a close variant. The trigger feels different from the standard model even without pulling it. Spring tension changes the reset. She stopped. Looked at Mercer. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that fills up with the sound of people realizing something has changed, but not yet knowing what. "How?" Stroud said, and then didn't continue. "I told you," Ava said. "I read." That's it. Mercer's jaw had a particular set to it when she was recalibrating, a slight tension at the corners, a tightening around the eyes, and Rael, watching from the corner, saw it click into place. She was not going to let this go. That was the danger point with certain kinds of pride. It didn't back down from information that should have recalibrated it. It pushed back harder, because backing down felt like loss, and loss was intolerable, and so the response to evidence was more pressure, more challenge, more testing. Because somewhere in the back of the mind was a version of events where the test finally produces the failure that makes the original assumption correct. "You know what those are," Mercer said, voice even. "Anyone can memorize specs from the internet." She looked at the others. "Let's see if she knows what to do with one." Stroud was already shaking his head slightly. Not out of mercy, Rael thought, but out of risk calculation. If she somehow passed, the optics were bad. "Captain, this isn't—" "I'm not asking her to live fire anything, Stroud." Mercer's voice had the tone of someone who has already decided. "I want to see a disassembly. Armory anteroom, 5 minutes." She looked at Ava. "Unless you'd rather get back to the floors." "I'll come," Ava said. The Armory anteroom was a 10 by 12 room off the main secured space, used for maintenance, inspection, and, in this case, whatever this had become. Fluorescent lights, a metal table bolted to the wall, smell of CLP oil and metal that was the particular smell of serious firearms kept in serious condition. Stroud placed an M4 variant on the table. A training model, cleared, confirmed empty by 2 separate checks. Bolt locked back, chamber flagged, 2 observers watching. "Field strip," Mercer said. "Go!" Ava looked at the weapon for 1 second. Then she picked it up. She worked through the disassembly with the kind of economy that comes from 10,000 repetitions. Takedown pins, upper from lower, charging handle, and bolt carrier grouped together, bolt disassembled to components without fumbling. Cam pin, firing pin, bolt from the carrier, buffer, and spring. 14 components laid in sequence on the mat. 43 seconds. Rael knew the standard, 2 minutes for qualified soldiers. Elite units pushed toward 90 seconds. He'd seen range instructors hit 60. 43 seconds was not someone who'd read about it. The room was very quiet. "Reassemble," Mercer said. Her voice was flat now. The performance was gone. 38 seconds. She held up the weapon, ran a press check on the empty chamber out of muscle memory, and set it down. Nobody said anything. A trainee near the back of the small crowd made a sound that was not quite a word. Mercer looked at Ava, then at the weapon, then back at Ava. "Where'd you learn that?" "I've had a lot of time to practice," Ava said. "That's not an answer." "No, ma'am, it's not." Another silence. A different quality this time. Denser, more complicated. Stroud stepped forward. "Captain, I think—" Range, Mercer said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Ava with an expression that had crossed through amusement and frustration and was now something else, something less comfortable. I want to see her on the range. Raven Point's primary training range was a 300-meter outdoor facility with steel plate targets at variable distances and a covered shooting line with 10 positions. The wind came in from the northwest that afternoon, steady at maybe 12 miles per hour, with gusts that pushed 15. Gray sky, no rain yet, but the smell of it in the air. The word had spread. By the time they reached the range, the crowd was larger than it should have been for the middle of a Friday afternoon. Officers, senior NCOs, trainees who'd found excuses to be walking in the direction of the range. About 40 people settling into the kind of casual positioning that means everyone is pretending to have a reason to be there. Mercer handed Ava a pistol qualification course, a standard target array at 7, 15, and 25 meters. Combat accuracy standard, center mass hits, time pressure, mandatory reloads. Standard qual run, Mercer said. Go when you're ready. Ava picked up the pistol, checked it, cleared it, reloaded from the rounds on the table. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the targets the way someone looks at a map, extracting information, planning a route. She ran the qual. She finished with 32 hits out of 32, including 4 at 25 meters that would have been considered exceptional for an infantry officer. Mercer stared at the target carrier rolling back toward the line. Rifle, she said. Stroud said something low under his breath that might have been a warning or a prayer. The M4 went to Ava. Fresh magazine, 300 meters, a steel silhouette plate that the instructors used for demonstration because the candidates rarely hit it reliably past 250. Ava settled into position, prone, not using the bench, just the ground and her own body, and made 3 adjustments that took about 4 seconds. Wind, range, something about her position that she corrected without being asked. She fired 5 rounds. 5 impacts on the 300-meter plate, audible as flat metallic cracks with the delay of distance, arriving a beat after the shots. Nobody in the crowd said anything. Rael looked at Mercer's face. She was very still. The room-clearing exercise was Stroud's contribution, which surprised Rael. Stroud had seemed like the most likely person to try to shut this down, but there was something happening now that had moved past institutional caution, and even Stroud seemed caught in the current of it. The Kill House, a mock-up structure of plywood rooms used for CQB training, sat at the south end of the facility. If she's going to claim she knows what she's doing, Stroud said, to Mercer, not to Ava, then let's see CQB fundamentals, movement, angles, muzzle discipline. Full walkthrough, I grade it. Mercer looked at Ava. You've gone this far. What's the scenario? Ava asked. Stroud blinked. What? What's the threat environment, number of contacts, expected position, civilian presence, entry point? Stroud stared at her. Single entry, 2 rooms, 2 targets. Armed? Yes. Civilian? 1. Room 2. She nodded once. I'll need a cover person. You're doing it alone. Then the civilian has a significant risk of incidental contact from... It's a training exercise, Mercer said. Yes, ma'am. Ava accepted the training weapon, a blue-barreled simulation pistol used for exactly these drills, and moved toward the entry. What followed was something Rael had only seen from trained operators who'd had years of real-world repetition. She didn't rush. She didn't perform. She sliced the entry angle before crossing the threshold, used the doorframe as cover before exposure, moved through the first room with the kind of controlled speed that doesn't look fast but covers distance efficiently, cleared corners in sequence before committing movement, identified the threat in the second room from the threshold rather than crossing into the line of fire, and used the positioning of the civilian silhouette so as a constraint that she visibly adjusted around. Stroud stood at the observation window. His pen hadn't moved on the grading sheet. Ava came out the exit, cleared her weapon from habit, looked at them. How many years? Rael asked. He hadn't planned to say anything. It came out of him before he decided on it. She looked at him. A beat. Long enough, she said. That evening, the crowd in the mess hall had a different texture, quieter in some places, louder in others. The kind of split that happens when something shakes a group's shared understanding and people don't yet agree on what they've seen. Mercer's table was subdued. At the end of the meal, she approached the security office, the building's administrative hub, which among other things handled background checks on all contracted staff. She'd been thinking about it all afternoon. The disassembly time, the pistol qual, the 300-meter hits, the CQB walkthrough. All of it pointed in one direction, and that direction was, this woman is not what her badge says she is. There were two possible explanations. Either she had a legitimate background that nobody here knew about, which raised serious clearance and vetting questions about how she'd ended up with a mop in a tactical training center. Or she was something else, something that needed to be handled differently. I need a full background on the maintenance contractor, Mercer said to the security administrator, a warrant officer named Dake, who had seen enough in 12 years to not show surprise anymore. The one assigned to East Corridor, Carter. Dake wrote it down. How deep? Everything. Mercer paused. Include federal flags. Dake nodded. Tomorrow morning. Tonight, Mercer said. Dake looked up at her. Tonight, she said again. He nodded and reached for the phone. The east hallway was quiet by 2200. Most of the facility had stood down for the evening. The overnight watch rotated through on 2-hour cycles, minimal movement in the corridors, just the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of rain that had finally arrived. Ava was finishing her end-of-shift walkthrough, checking the hallway one last time before logging out. She moved slowly. Not because she was tired, she rarely looked tired, but with the particular slowness of someone who has been measured all day and is now allowing themselves to simply exist without being watched. She stopped in front of the display mount with the 4 rifles, looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at her reflection in the glass of the nearest framed photograph, one of the unit citation plaques, behind glass, showing her own image ghosted over the text of something someone had done somewhere that mattered. Her face told nothing. She reached out and straightened the laminated card on the Mark 12 display. It had been slightly crooked since the afternoon. Then she collected her cart and walked toward the exit. Behind her, in the security office, Warrant Officer Dake was watching a progress bar on his terminal crawl toward completion on a federal database query. The bar hit 100%. The file loaded. Dake leaned toward the screen and his face changed. He picked up the phone, called Mercer. Captain, he said, and his voice was different from usual, stripped of its normal mild disinterest, carrying something he was trying to contain. You need to come to the security office, now. A pause. I don't care what time it is, he said. You need to see this. Mercer arrived in 3 minutes. Still in her uniform, she hadn't gone off duty yet. She came through the security office door and Dake was standing rather than sitting, which she registered without registering it, and he turned the monitor toward her without speaking. She read. The file was flagged at the top with a classification tier she recognized, which meant it had taken federal-level clearance to unlock even the summary. The summary was what Dake had pulled. The full file was behind another layer of access that neither of them had. But the summary was enough. Carter. Ava M. Date of birth, a service branch, a date of entry. Career trajectory that moved fast, too fast for standard track, which meant either exceptional performance or exceptional circumstances. And the annotation beside that entry said the former. Specialty designator that Mercer read twice because the first time she thought she'd misread it. Awards and citations, several of them behind classification markers that showed only the award type, not the action, which meant the actions were still classified. And then, near the end of the career section, a status notation that made Mercer go very still. Status: retired. Medical/compassionate. Voluntary separation, date confirmed. Prior status: redacted, see classified addendum. Presumed deceased notation rescinded, date classified. Mercer looked up from the screen. Dake was watching her. She's been here for 6 months, Mercer said. Yes, ma'am. With a maintenance badge. Yes, ma'am. Mercer looked back at the screen, read the specialty designator again. Outside in the corridor, Ava Carter's footsteps were fading toward the exit. Quiet, even. The sound of someone who had somewhere to be. Mercer looked at the monitor a moment longer. Then she looked at Dake. Pull the full file in the morning, she said. Full federal access, whatever clearance level it takes. I want everything. Yes, ma'am. She left. In the hallway, she stopped and stood for a moment in the fluorescent light, with the rain sound coming from somewhere above her and the smell of gun oil and old coffee moving through the ventilation. And she looked at the empty corridor where a woman with a mop had just finished her shift. The corridor was clean. It was always clean. For the first time all week, Brooke Mercer felt something she didn't know how to categorize. She walked back to her office and didn't sleep well. And at 0300, she was still awake when her secured phone buzzed with a message from a federal contact she'd included in Dake's access request. The message said, "This file requires notification of 3 separate command authorities before access is granted. Initiating now. Expect contact." And beneath that, in the terse language of federal administrative systems, subject file contains active classification protections. Access log being forwarded per protocol to redacted. And then, at the very bottom, a single flag note that had been automatically attached to any query on this file for a period Mercer couldn't see the start of. Any inquiry into this subject must be reported immediately to the Joint Special Operations Oversight Office. Contact initiated automatically upon file access. Mercer sat in her dark office with the phone in her hand, and the rain on the window and the slow realization building in her chest that the woman she had called Janitor in front of 50 soldiers, the woman she had publicly mocked, challenged, and paraded in front of a crowd like an entertainment, was not just someone with an unusual background. She was someone whose file automatically triggered a federal notification protocol, and that protocol had just been activated. Because of a background check Brooke Mercer had ordered at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, her phone buzzed again. An incoming call from a number with a DC area code. She stared at it for 1 second. Then she answered. The voice on the other end of the line was calm in the way that people are calm when they've delivered bad news so many times it no longer costs them anything. Captain Mercer. Yes. This is Deputy Director Callum Hess, Joint Special Operations Command Oversight Division. You initiated a federal background inquiry approximately 40 minutes ago on an individual designated Carter, Ava M. I did. I need you to tell me the nature of that inquiry. Mercer's hand was steady on the phone, but something in her chest had changed rhythms. I'm the Senior Training Officer at Raven Point Tactical Center. The individual in question is contracted maintenance staff. Her demonstrated skill set was inconsistent with her personnel designation. I requested a background check as a security precaution. A pause. Short, but deliberate. Captain, the file you attempted to access carries a joint classification status that triggers mandatory command notification. I need to ask you directly. What was the nature of the skill set that prompted this inquiry? Mercer looked at the wall of her office, a framed photograph of her own promotion ceremony 6 years ago. She looked younger in it than she remembered feeling. Weapons familiarity, she said. Expert level. Disassembly time well under standard qualification. Expert pistol and rifle marksmanship at extended range. Advanced CQB movement with tactical decision-making. A beat. For someone whose badge says facility maintenance. Another pause. Longer. I see. The deputy director's voice hadn't changed, but the weight behind it had shifted slightly. Captain, I'm going to need you to hold that information within your immediate command structure for the moment. Do not distribute the background results to additional personnel. The file is going to be reviewed at the oversight level before any further access is granted. Understood. One more thing. A slight change in his tone. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that Mercer filed without naming. The subject of this file. Where is she now? Mercer looked at the clock on her wall, 0317. She logged out at 22:30, Mercer said. She's contracted, not residential. She doesn't live on the facility. All right. Another breath. I'll be in contact within the hour. Do not discuss this with your staff until you hear from me. The line went dead. Mercer set the phone on her desk. Outside her window, the rain had intensified. A full November downpour now, streaking the glass, turning the parking lot lights into blurred halos. She sat in the dark office and thought about 43 seconds. 38 seconds. 5 impacts at 300 meters. The way Ava Carter had moved through the kill house like she'd done it 1,000 times, which Mercer was beginning to understand, might not be an exaggeration. She opened her desk drawer, found a legal pad, and started writing down everything she remembered from the file summary. She wrote until the phone rang again. The call from D.C. had one concrete result. By 0600 Saturday morning, the Raven Point Security Office had been contacted by 3 separate federal entities requesting information about the background check. Dake, who had come in early after Mercer's text and was now operating on 4 hours of sleep and bad coffee, processed each contact with the methodical care of a man who understood that paperwork could protect you or bury you, and the difference was in the details. He also, somewhere between the second and third call, pulled up the facility's contracted maintenance roster and looked at the entry for Carter, Ava M., a second time. Standard vetting. Background check completed at time of hire, 8 months prior. The check had come back clean. No flags, no criminal record, no disqualifying factors. The vetting had been performed by the facility's civilian HR contractor, which was a private firm that handled background investigations for a dozen similar installations. The check had been clean because someone had made it clean. Dake sat with that understanding for a while. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and went back to the phones. Rael found out the way most information moved at Raven Point. Through the institutional osmosis of a small community where everyone ate in the same mess hall and the walls between office windows were thin. By 0800, he knew there had been some kind of federal contact overnight. By 0900, he knew it was connected to the background check on the maintenance woman. By 0930, when he saw Mercer crossing the parade ground with the particular stride of someone carrying something heavy and moving through it rather than around it, he decided to fall in beside her. She didn't tell him to leave. That was its own kind of answer. "You pulled her file," he said. "Yes." "And?" She walked 3 more steps. "And it's classified above my clearance level." "That's not an answer about what you found." "No," she said. "It's not." He let it sit. They reached the far edge of the parade ground, where the wind came in from the tree line with a cold edge, and Mercer stopped walking. She stood looking at the pine trees for a moment, and Rael stood beside her, and neither of them said anything. "She caught that clipboard yesterday morning," Rael said. "I was there." "I know you were there." "The catch wasn't reflexive," he said. "It was a trained response. She controlled the trajectory before it registered consciously. That's not something you get from enthusiasm or practice. That's years of conditioning." Mercer said nothing. "I've seen it in 3 people in my career," he said. "All of them special operations." Still nothing from Mercer. "Her balance is off," he continued. "Her footwork, the way she moves through doorways. She occupies space differently from civilians, differently from standard infantry. She moves like somebody who's done close-quarters work in environments where hesitation costs lives." He paused. "That woman is not a maintenance contractor, Captain." "I know what she is," Mercer said, and then stopped. Rael looked at her sideways. "Or I know what she was," Mercer corrected. Her voice was flat. "The file says retired." "Retired and running a mop at a tactical training center." "Apparently." He thought about that. "She's hiding." "She's working," Mercer said. "There's a difference. Not if she's hiding while she works." Mercer turned and looked at him, and in the flat morning light he could see something in her face that hadn't been there yesterday. Not guilt exactly, but its precursor. The thing that shows up when pride starts receiving information that punctures it, and pride isn't quite ready to go quietly. "What do you want, Rael?" "I want to know what we're doing about her." "The federal contacts have asked for discretion until the file review is complete." "And the people who saw her yesterday?" Mercer's jaw tightened. "What about them?" "About 30 soldiers watched her outshoot our instructors and move through the kill house like she'd done it professionally. They're talking. By lunch, it'll be the whole facility." "Then they're talking," Mercer said. "That's not my most pressing problem right now." She walked away. Rael stayed at the edge of the parade ground and watched her go, and thought about a maintenance worker who knew the difference between a Schmidt and Bender PM2 and a standard scope by looking at the turret caps, and who'd asked about civilian presence before entering a CQB exercise, and who'd cleared the weapon from muscle memory when she came out the exit. Who does that? Ava arrived for her Saturday shift at 4:45, same as every other day. She didn't look like someone who knew that 3 federal offices had made calls about her in the night. She didn't look like someone who knew anything at all beyond what was in front of her. The cart, the east corridor, the scuffed floor that had picked up mud from Friday's rain. But she had parked differently. Rael, who had stayed late and was coming in from the north lot, noticed it. Her vehicle, a dark blue pickup, several years old, nothing distinctive, was parked in the lot's corner position. Nose out, oriented toward the exit, backed against the fence. Habit positioning. The kind of parking choice made by someone who has internalized, deep enough that it requires no conscious decision, the importance of rapid egress. He filed it. She didn't look at him when she passed with her cart in the hallway. She didn't look at anyone. She moved through her route with the same contained efficiency. And Rael walked the opposite direction and gave her room, and he thought, she knows. She might not know exactly what happened overnight, but she knows something is different. She can feel it in the building the same way certain people can feel a change in pressure before a weather system arrives. The morning proceeded with the surface normalcy of a facility that doesn't know how to acknowledge something it hasn't officially named yet. Trainee PT on the parade ground, mess hall breakfast, shift changeover in the security office. The instructors ran their morning sessions. Ava cleaned the floors. But the quality of attention had changed. People who had watched the previous day's events kept finding reasons to pass through the east corridor. They were quieter about it than they would have been yesterday. Less performative, less crowd energy. More the thoughtful observation of people revising their understanding of something they thought they'd already understood. Mercer found her at 10:30 in the anteroom off the armory wing. She came alone, which surprised Ava, though she didn't show it. She looked up from the supply cabinet she was restocking and waited. And Mercer stood in the doorway for a moment with her arms crossed in the way people cross their arms when they're preparing rather than defensive. "I need to ask you some questions," Mercer said. "All right. Directly. I prefer it." Mercer stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The anteroom was small. 2 people in it felt like a choice rather than a coincidence. She looked at the cleaning supplies, the fluorescent light humming above them, the metal shelving. Then she looked at Ava. "Where did you serve?" "I don't discuss my service history with people I've just met," Ava said. Tone even, not hostile, like a boundary that's been established a long time ago and is simply being stated. "I'm the senior training officer at a federal tactical facility, and I'm asking you directly." "And I'm a maintenance contractor," Ava said. "My employment agreement covers facility services. It doesn't include a disclosure obligation about personal history." Mercer studied her. "You know I ran your background." A beat. Something moved across Ava's face. Not surprise, but the acknowledgement of a thing that had already been anticipated. "I figured you would eventually." "You figured." "You're a thorough officer," Ava said, and it wasn't sarcastic. It was a matter of time. "My inquiry triggered a federal notification protocol," Mercer said. 3 separate oversight contacts before 6 this morning. Your file is classified above my clearance level." Ava said nothing. She turned and finished placing a box of cleaning cloths on the shelf, straightening it with the automatic care of someone who does every task the same way, regardless of what's happening around them. "Are you going to tell me who you are?" Mercer asked. "You have more information than you're sharing," Ava said. "You got something from the file summary before the access flag triggered. What did you read?" Mercer was quiet. "Because the way you're asking me questions," Ava continued, not looking at her, arranging supplies on a shelf, "isn't the way you'd ask if you had nothing. It's the way you'd ask if you had a partial picture and you're trying to fill in the edges." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Service branch? A specialty designator I recognized, awards behind classification markers, and a status notation that said retired, with a prior status that was redacted, including something about a presumed deceased notation that had been rescinded." The room was very quiet. Ava kept her hands on the shelf for a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped back and turned. Her face hadn't changed, but something in the room had. Some ambient quality of the air, the way it changes before something shifts. "You should leave that file alone," she said. "I don't think I can do that." "It's not a threat," Ava said. "I mean it practically. Whatever you think is in that file, the full version, it's going to create complications for you that you're not expecting. Not because of anything I've done here, because of what the file is, who has access, what protocols are wrapped around it." She paused. "There are people above your command structure who already know you looked. They're already deciding how to handle it. Mercer stared at her. How do you know that? Ava looked at her steadily. Because it's not the first time someone at a facility ran my background. The implication settled in Mercer's chest slowly, like something heavy lowering into water. Not the first time, which meant this had happened somewhere before, which meant Ava had done this before, but taken a job like this, in a place like this, and waited for someone to look close enough. Why? Mercer said. Why are you here? Why a maintenance job? Why this facility? I clean floors, Ava said. I'm good at it. The hours work. That's not an answer. No. She reached for the cart handle. But it's all I have for you right now. I'm going to get the full file, Mercer said. Federal access is in process. I'll have it by Monday. Ava nodded once. Not a concession, not worry either. Just acknowledged, understood, filed. Do what you need to do, Captain, she said. You will anyway. She wheeled the cart out of the anteroom. The facility mess hall had a particular atmosphere on Saturday afternoons. Looser than weekdays, the structured rhythm of training schedules giving way to something more lateral, clusters of people who'd finished their primary obligations and hadn't yet decided what to do with the remaining hours. Card games at corner tables. People with laptops that were technically for work. The long table in the center clearing out slowly. Stroud found 2 other officers at the back table and sat with them. And the conversation arrived at the topic that had been circling all day the way conversations at enclosed facilities always arrive at the thing everyone is actually thinking about. She knew the HK had a modified trigger, Stroud said, without touching it. She said the spring tension changes the reset, and you can feel it without pulling the trigger. He set down his coffee. You can't get that from reading. You get that from pulling triggers on modified weapons until you feel the difference in your hands without thinking about it. She could have handled weapons before. Civilian range time. At the level she showed yesterday? Stroud shook his head. That's not civilian range time. That's not even enthusiast level. 43 seconds on a field strip is operator territory. I've seen E8S who couldn't hit that. So what's she doing here? Stroud didn't answer that. He didn't have one. A lieutenant named Ferris, who'd been listening more than talking, leaned forward. I talked to one of the guys from the overnight watch. He said there were federal calls coming into the security office before 6 this morning. Because Mercer pulled her background. And? Stroud moved his coffee cup. And the file came back flagged in a way that triggered federal notification. That's all I know. Mercer's not sharing beyond that. A maintenance contractor with a federally flagged file, Ferris said. Apparently. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. She asked about civilian presence before the kill house run, Ferris said. Did anyone else notice that? She asked Stroud directly. How many contacts, civilian presence, entry point? That's not something you ask if you've read about CQB in a book. That's decision-making framework. Threat assessment before entry. It's conditioned. Stroud nodded slowly. He'd noticed. He'd been trying not to think about it too hard. The worst part, he said, and then stopped. What? I graded the kill house run. He looked at his coffee. I was going to give her a technical pass, acknowledged the fundamentals were sound, but I scored it against standard. Yishm, Isheti, he paused. She cleared it clean. Better than clean. The way she used the door frame on the second room before committing, that was a decision that prevents fratricide in live scenarios. It's a judgment call that a lot of experienced operators get wrong under pressure. He set down the cup. She didn't get it wrong. She did it automatically, like it was just how you move through a door. Ferris was quiet for a moment. So who is she? I don't know, Stroud said. But I'm starting to think we handled yesterday very poorly. Nobody disagreed with that. The afternoon brought a second conversation that mattered. This one in Rael's temporary office, a small room off the north corridor that he'd been assigned for the duration of his visiting instructor tenure. He was writing session notes when the knock came, and the door opened to Ava Carter with her cart parked in the corridor and her cleaning supplies in hand. East offices, she said. I can come back. Come in, he said. She entered and moved to the small window, running a cloth across the sill with the automatic motion of someone who cleans wherever they are, whether or not they're being watched. Which was, Rael had decided, a significant piece of information about who she was. You didn't say anything yesterday, she said, not looking at him. During any of it. I watched. You could have stopped it. I wasn't sure I should, he said. She looked at him then. Why not? He set down his pen. Because you were handling it, and because stopping it would have required me to know more than I did, and I didn't. But you knew something. I knew your balance was wrong for a maintenance worker. He held her gaze. I knew the clipboard catch wasn't a reflex. I knew the way you went quiet when Mercer was pushing had a specific quality to it, the kind of quiet that isn't passive. What kind is it? Controlled, he said. The kind where you've made a decision about how much to let in, where the noise is just noise because you've decided it is. She turned back to the window, wiped the corner of the sill. Mercer's going to get the full file, Rael said. Federal access. She told you that? She told me. Does that concern you? A pause, small but there. What's in the file isn't going to surprise anyone who paid attention yesterday, she said. It'll just give it a name. And the rest of it? She stopped wiping. The rest of it, she repeated, and her voice was even, but something had shifted very slightly in the weight of it. Is mine. Rael nodded. He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that there are things people keep, not because they're hiding them, but because they belong to them. And the act of keeping is itself the protection of something that matters. There's a veteran in the city hospital, he said, carefully. On the long-term floor, I've heard the nurses mention a family member who comes in every morning before shift and every evening after. He paused. Someone mentioned a pickup truck in the hospital lot, dark blue. Ava's back was to him. She didn't turn. I'm just an observer, he said. I see things. She set the cleaning cloth on the window ledge, left it there rather than pocketing it, which wasn't like her. He's declining, she said. Quiet. Not fragile. There was no fragility in her, but exposed in the way of someone who has chosen, for a moment, to acknowledge something true rather than contain it. Faster than they expected. The timeline they gave us in September is already wrong. Rael said nothing. I needed a job that had flexible hours, she said, and wasn't in a hospital. She picked up the cloth. Hospitals smell like... She stopped, started again. I've spent enough time in hospitals. What did he do? Rael asked. Infantry, 31 years. A pause. He was better at it than I was. She finished the window and moved to the door. Ava. He hadn't used her name before. She paused. For what it's worth. What you did yesterday. Even if they can't see past the badge. Even if they keep pushing. He looked at her steadily. You didn't need to prove anything, and you did it anyway. That matters. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Or it gives them more to argue about, she said. She left. The cartwheels made their quiet sound down the corridor. Well, Monday arrived with the particular brand of institutional tension, the kind that builds up over a weekend when people have had time to think, and not enough information to think correctly. The trainees had pieced together a version of events that was approximately accurate and dramatically inflated, which was inevitable. By the time the 0700 formation concluded, the story circulating was that the maintenance woman had outshot every qualified instructor on the range, identified weapons by touch in the dark, and had either a classified military background or was some kind of federal observer placed in the facility. The second theory had gained more traction than Mercer would have liked. She was waiting for the federal access when Stroud came to her office at 0830 with something on his face she hadn't seen before. 3 trainees came to me this morning, he said. They want to formally request Carter as an instructional resource. Mercer stared at him. Specifically for CQB fundamentals, Stroud continued. They said the walkthrough on Friday was more useful than the last 2 weeks of classroom instruction. He paused. I told them I'd pass it along. She's maintenance staff, Stroud. I know what her badge says. The terminal on Mercer's desk pinged. Federal access granted. File available. She looked at Stroud. He looked at the terminal. Go, she said. He didn't move. Stroud. I think I should be here, he said. When you read it. She considered that. Then she turned the monitor slightly, and Stroud pulled up the chair from the corner, and they read it together, the full file, and the room was very quiet for a long time. Outside, Ava was in the east corridor, cleaning the floor. The fluorescent lights hummed above her with the same indifference they always had, and her cartwheels turned on the same concrete that had needed mopping every morning for 6 months. And somewhere in the security wing, a printer was producing pages that had her name at the top and her life below it in the sanitized language of military records. And she knew, she had always known, that this moment would arrive. She mopped the same patch of floor twice without noticing. That was the thing about carrying something for long enough. You stopped noticing the weight. You stopped noticing the effort. It was just how you moved through the world with this thing you carried, and the only time it reminded you it was there was when someone else was about to pick it up and look at it. She wrung out the mop, kept working. Behind the closed door of the senior training officer's office, Brooke Mercer reached the section of the file she'd been bracing for since the summary. The classified operations, the Valor citations, the deployment history, and she stopped at a date that was about 5 years back and a line of text that described a mission status, and she felt the thing in her chest that she'd been trying to hold off all weekend finally arrive without permission. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something closer to the understanding of a specific kind of error, the kind you make when you confuse the absence of uniform for the absence of service, when you mistake quiet for ignorance and stillness for weakness, and the choice to disappear for the inability to be seen. The kind of error that, once you've made it and understood it, you spend a long time carrying. She closed the file, looked at the door, then at Stroud, who was sitting very still and not saying anything, which was its own kind of communication. She pushed back from the desk and stood up and walked out of the office. And she went to the east corridor, and Ava was there with her mop and her cart and her gray uniform, and Mercer stopped 6 feet away and Ava looked up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer said, "I need you to come to a command meeting, today, 1300. Ava's face gave nothing. "That's not a request," Mercer said. Her voice was different from Friday. The performance register was entirely gone. What was left was something flatter and more honest. "It's not a challenge either," she paused. "There are things that need to be said in front of the right people. I'm asking you to be there." "What kind of meeting?" Ava said. "The kind where I do the talking," Mercer said. "And you don't have to say anything at all if you don't want to." Ava looked at her for a moment, reading her, the way Rael had watched her read rooms and angles and weapons, and then she nodded once and returned to the mop. Mercer walked back toward the command wing. In the corridor behind her, the sound of the wheels stopped. Ava stood still for a moment, just a moment, just the space between one motion and the next. And then her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she looked at the screen, and the number was the hospital's main line, and something moved across her face that had nothing to do with Raven Point or Mercer or the file or any of it. She answered. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. Her voice had a different quality than it ever had in this building, compressed and private, and containing something vast underneath it. She ended the call, stood in the east corridor for 3 more seconds. Then she left the cart where it was and walked toward the exit without her coat, into the November cold, moving with the same controlled efficiency she always had, except faster, now, much faster, not running, but the pace just below it. And Rael, who saw her cross the parking lot from the window of the north corridor, watched her get into the dark blue pickup and back out and be gone before he had time to decide what he'd seen. He stood at the window a while longer. The cart sat alone in the east corridor, the mop still dripping. The hospital was 12 minutes from Raven Point if you didn't stop for lights, and Ava didn't stop for lights. Callaway Veterans Medical Center sat on the north edge of the city, a 7-story concrete structure from the 70s that had been added onto so many times it looked like it had been assembled by 3 different architects who'd never spoken to each other. The parking structure beside it was always full by 800. Ava knew the 3rd floor had spaces near the stairwell that turned over faster than the rest, and she took one without thinking about it. And she was through the stairwell door and moving up before the truck was fully cooled. 4th floor. Long-term care. The nurses here knew her by sight, had for 4 months. And the one at the desk, a heavy-set woman named Priya, who worked the Monday morning shift with the efficiency of someone who had stopped taking the job personally and started taking it seriously, looked up when Ava came through the fire door and said, "He's stable," before Ava could ask. The call said, "He had an episode, respiratory. It resolved. He's stable now, but the attending wanted family notified." Priya was already around the desk. "He's been asking for you." The room was 412. Ava had walked this corridor so many times she knew which tiles were loose and which light fixture buzzed at the wrong frequency and which room always smelled faintly of whatever the patient inside had requested from the family. In 412's case, for the last several weeks, nothing. Her father had lost his appetite for outside smells somewhere in October. She pushed the door. He was sitting up slightly, which was better than she'd been bracing for. The oxygen line was back. It had been removed last week when his numbers improved, and its return now meant the improvement hadn't held. His face was the face she'd been watching change for 8 months, the slow erosion of a man who had been physically substantial his whole life, who had carried weight and presence and a particular way of occupying a room, and who was now thinner than she'd ever seen him, and somehow still, in some way she couldn't describe, more present than most people she'd ever stood next to. He looked at her when she came in. "You drove fast," he said. "I drove the speed limit." "Ava." "Fine," she said. "I drove fast." She pulled the chair to the bedside, the same chair she'd brought it from home 2 months ago because the hospital chairs hurt her back, and she spent enough hours in this room that it mattered. She sat, looked at him. "How do you feel?" "Like a man who's been sick for 8 months," he said. His voice was rougher than it used to be, a texture to it now that hadn't been there a year ago, but the directness was unchanged. Sergeant Major Leonard Carter had been direct his entire life, and apparently intended to remain so. "The nurse said you're still at the facility." "I am." "Anything happen?" She looked at him. He'd always been able to read her the same way she read rooms, the habit of a man who'd spent 3 decades reading soldiers. "Some things," she said. "Good things or bad things?" "Complicated things." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had the same quality. "When are things with you ever not complicated?" He shifted slightly. The movement cost him something. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes, but he didn't make a noise about it because he never did. "Tell me." "You need to rest." "I'll rest when I'm dead," he said, which, given recent events, appears to be coming faster than advertised. "So tell me." She told him. Not all of it. Not the federal calls, not the overnight access request, not the details of the file that was now sitting open on Mercer's monitor, but the shape of it. The clipboard catch that had started things, the armory corridor, the range, the kill house. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "They laughed at you," he said. "They did. And then they stopped laughing. Eventually." He looked at the window. The November sky outside was the pale gray of old concrete. "How'd it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet." "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it goes." He looked back at her. "You going to the meeting?" She'd mentioned the 1-300 command meeting, just the fact of it, not what it meant. "I said I would." "Mercer," he said. "What's she like?" Ava considered. Smart, career invested, made assumptions she's now trying to revise. A pause. "I've met worse." "And the one who watched," he said. He'd registered that detail. "The one who didn't say anything." "Rael." "What's he like?" "Observant," she said. "Careful. He sees things." She looked at her father. "He figured out about the hospital." Leonard Carter was quiet for a moment. "He say anything about it?" "No, just told me he'd noticed." She paused. "I think he was being kind." Her father looked at her with an expression she recognized from childhood, the look he'd had when she'd said something that surprised him in a way he didn't want to make a big deal of. "People being kind to you is still uncomfortable. I function fine with kindness." "You function fine with everything. That's different from being comfortable with it." She didn't argue with that. A nurse came in at 10:15 to check the oxygen levels and note something on the chart, and Ava moved the chair back to give her room and stood at the window while the nurse worked, looking at the city below. The grid of it, rooftops and streets, and the bare trees of a park 2 blocks over that she'd walked through once in September when she'd needed air. After the nurse left, she stayed at the window. "Ava," her father's voice. "I'm here. Go to the meeting." "I will. I mean now. Go. I'm not going anywhere in the next 4 hours, and that nurse is intolerable if she doesn't have someone to lecture, so I'll have company." He paused. "Whatever's about to happen at that facility, You should be there for it. She turned from the window. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because you spent 3 years convincing everyone you weren't worth looking at. And now they're looking. He took a slow breath through the oxygen line. Don't waste it. She stood at the window a moment longer. Then she picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. I'll be back by 1800, she said. I know you will. She kissed him on the forehead the way she'd started doing 3 months ago, when it became clear that the time for stoicism between them was less available than it had been. And he let her. And she left. She arrived back at Raven Point at 11:47 and went to the locker room to change into civilian clothes. She kept a set in her locker for occasions that required her to exist in this building as something other than the person with the cart, which until today had been never. The clothes were plain, dark slacks, a gray long-sleeve shirt, boots. Nothing that announced anything. She looked at herself in the locker room mirror for approximately 2 seconds. Then she went to find the command meeting room. It was the building's primary briefing space. Oval table, 12 chairs, a wall-mounted screen currently dark, windows that looked toward the training grounds. When she arrived at 12:55, the room already held Mercer, Stroud, Rael, Warrant Officer Dake from the security office, and 2 people she didn't recognize who were seated at the far end of the table with the particular posture of people who have come from somewhere else. One of them she placed immediately. Military bearing, civilian clothes, the kind of watch that cost more than most officers' monthly pay, and was worn without self-consciousness. Somewhere in his late 50s, the way he held the room's perimeter in his peripheral vision without appearing to was the habit of a man who had once needed to do it professionally and had never fully stopped. The other was younger, with a tablet and a government-issue laptop, and the composure of someone whose job was to be present without being the most important person in the room. Ava sat in the chair across from Mercer. Nobody introduced themselves immediately. The 2 people from D.C. looked at her, assessed her, in the way she was assessed all day, but different in kind. Not the assessment of people deciding whether to dismiss her, the assessment of people who already know they shouldn't. Mercer cleared her throat. This meeting was requested by Deputy Director Hess, she said, nodding toward the man with the watch. His office has been in contact with Raven Point since Saturday morning regarding the federal inquiry into... I know what the inquiry was about, Ava said. Mercer stopped. Hess leaned forward slightly. Captain Carter. The room shifted around that title. Not the maintenance badge, not the gray uniform. The rank she'd actually held, stated plainly in the voice of a man who had read the full file. Deputy Director, she said, I appreciate you agreeing to be here. I didn't have much choice once the access log forwarded to your office. No, he said. I suppose not. He folded his hands on the table. I'll be direct. The notification protocol on your file is designed to do exactly what it did. Alert oversight when someone starts pulling on threads connected to operations that are still classified. Captain Mercer's inquiry was legitimate. The file lock wasn't designed to prevent appropriate command from understanding who is in their facility. It was designed to control how that information moves once it's been accessed. He paused. We're here because the information has been accessed, and because there are some decisions to make about how to proceed. What kind of decisions? Ava said. That depends partly on you. Hess looked at her steadily. Your presence at this facility, unofficial, undisclosed, under a maintenance designation, creates certain complications. I'd like to understand the reasoning. The reasoning is personal, she said. I understand that. But personal reasons that land a former special operations officer in a federal training facility without disclosure create institutional liability. I passed a background check. You passed a check that was performed by a private contractor using a record set that was, Hess paused, not complete. I'm aware. You're aware because you made choices that resulted in an incomplete record, Hess said. I'm not here to relitigate those choices, but I need to understand whether this facility was selected deliberately, and if so, why? Ava looked at him, then at the window. The training grounds outside were empty at this hour. The morning rotation had finished, the afternoon hadn't started. My father is at Callaway Veterans Medical Center, she said. 12 minutes from here. She looked back at Hess. The facility's contract position opened 8 months ago. The hours fit, the nature of the work fit. The location fit. She paused. That's the complete reasoning. You chose a tactical training center, Mercer said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a question wearing the shape of a statement. I'm familiar with tactical environments, Ava said. They're easier for me than most places. Easier, Stroud repeated, and then apparently couldn't think of what else to say about that. I know how they work, Ava said simply. The rhythms, the hierarchy, the particular way military facilities operate. I know how to exist in that environment without drawing attention. She looked at the table briefly. I had been doing it successfully for 6 months. Until the clipboard, Rael said. She looked at him. Something passed between them that the rest of the table registered without being able to name. Until the clipboard, she agreed. The meeting ran until nearly 1500, which was longer than it needed to be and shorter than it could have been. And when it was over, several things had been established that hadn't existed before noon. The first was that Raven Point would update its records to reflect Ava's actual background, not the classified specifics, which would remain behind their respective access tiers, but enough to satisfy the institutional need for accurate personnel information. The second was that the private HR contractor who had performed the original background check would be reviewed, which was a conversation involving Hess's office and the facilities command that Ava was not part of. The third, which came near the end and which nobody had specifically planned, was a question that Mercer asked with the careful phrasing of someone who had been thinking about it since Saturday morning and was finally ready to say it out loud. Is there a reason, Mercer said, that you couldn't take on an instructional role? Formally. Within the existing contractor framework, with appropriate disclosure and classification handling. Ava looked at her. The trainees who saw Friday's session are already requesting it, Stroud said. Not pushing. He said it quietly, like a fact being placed on the table for consideration. 3 came to me this morning. I cleaned floors, Ava said. You also cleared a kill house cleaner than my senior instructors, Stroud said. I graded it. I know what the sheet says. What would the role involve? Hess's assistant asked, the first time she'd spoken. CQB fundamentals, Mercer said. Weapons handling, possibly land navigation and tactical decision-making at the basic level. She looked at Ava. We have gaps. The instructors we have are qualified. They're not, she paused, choosing the word, experienced in the way that produces certain kinds of calibration. The room waited. Ava looked at the window for a moment, thought about her father's voice. Don't waste it. Let me think about it, she said. Fair, Mercer said. Hess nodded. Take the time you need. She was in the parking lot when Rael found her, which seemed to be his habit, catching her at transitions, in the between spaces, when she was neither fully inside the building nor entirely outside it. How's your father? He asked. Declining, she said. She unlocked the truck and stood with her hand on the door. They moved the timeline again this morning. That was what the call was about. He had a respiratory episode. I'm sorry. He's still him, she said. That's the thing. The body is failing faster than they expected, but he's still exactly who he always was. Sometimes I think that's the hardest part. There's nothing diminished about him except the physical. She stopped, looked at the parking structure wall. He told me to come to the meeting. Smart man. 31 years infantry, she said. He has opinions about when to engage and when to withdraw. And today? He said, engage. She got into the truck. Then, before she closed the door, he'd have been a better fit for that room than me. He always knew how to handle institutional dynamics. I was always better outside the institution. You were fine in there, Rael said. I was contained, she said. That's not the same thing. She closed the door and drove. The afternoon session ran until 1700. The trainees in Building C's second-floor classroom were running a tactical planning exercise, map work, radio protocols, fragmentary order structure, and the instructor, a staff sergeant named Boudin, who was competent and thorough and somewhat mechanical in the way of people who know the material cold but have never needed to make a real decision from it, was walking them through a scenario overlay when the door opened. Mercer came in first. Behind her was Ava, in civilian clothes, without the cart, without the gray uniform, without any of the props of the identity she'd been running for 6 months. 22 trainee faces turned. Some of them recognized her immediately. Some of them figured it out over the space of a few seconds. The room had a particular kind of silence. Not quiet, there was still the ambient sound of a working space, but the cognitive noise had stopped. Boudin looked at Mercer. "Captain." "Carry on, Sergeant. I'm going to have Ms. Carter observe the second half of the session." Observe was the word Mercer used. What actually happened was that Boudin got 8 minutes further into the scenario overlay before a trainee named Okafor raised his hand and asked a question about the radio call-out procedure for a hasty ambush position, and Boudin gave a technically correct answer that was missing 3 contextual factors that would matter in an actual execution. Ava, seated along the wall, said nothing. Boudin continued. Another trainee, a young woman named Solus, who had been the fastest on the pistol qual 2 weeks prior, caught something in Ava's expression that the rest of the room missed because she was sitting at an angle that gave her a sightline to Ava's face. And what she saw there was not disagreement exactly, but the focused stillness of someone watching someone else walk toward a hole they haven't seen yet. After the session ended and the trainees were filtering out, Solus stopped beside Ava. "You wanted to say something," Solus said. "Not confrontational, just certain." Ava looked at her. "During the radio protocol section," Solus said, "you had a reaction. I saw it." Boudin's answer was technically accurate, Ava said. But Ava was quiet for a moment. Then, in a hasty ambush position, the call-out procedure changes based on your fallback route. If the radio position compromises your egress geometry, the sequence Boudin described gets you killed before you can transmit. The standard protocol assumes a fixed element. In a hasty, you're usually mobile and potentially already taking fire. She paused. That's not a classroom detail. It's the kind of thing that only matters when it's the difference between transmitting and dying. Solus stared at her. "How do you know that?" she asked. Ava picked up her jacket from the chair. "I've had to choose," she said, and left the room. The next 3 days moved at the particular pace of an institution in the process of revising its own story about itself, which is to say, unevenly, with pockets of resistance and pockets of rapid recalibration, and a persistent undercurrent of conversation in the spaces between official moments. The trainees talked, the instructors talked, more carefully. Stroud ran into Ava in the armory anteroom on Tuesday morning. She was still doing the cleaning rotation. No formal change to her status had been processed yet, and stood in the doorway for a moment with the look of a man who has been rehearsing something. "Friday," he said. "The way I set that up. In the armory corridor with the crowd." Ava waited. "That was wrong," he said. It wasn't just poor judgment. It was." He stopped. "I used your position to make a point in front of people who were watching. That's not what I should have been doing." "You were following Mercer's lead," Ava said. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's accurate." Stroud stood in the doorway a moment longer. "The Kill House score. I wrote it up accurately." He paused. "I thought you should know that." "I didn't ask you to." "I know. I did it because it was accurate." He straightened slightly. "Whatever the file says about what you've done, you did the same thing here. In a training scenario with people watching and waiting for you to fail, you did the thing correctly." A pause. "That's worth noting." He left. Ava stood with the cleaning cloth in her hand for a moment. Then she went back to work. Wednesday afternoon brought the thing that changed everything, and it arrived with the particular lack of ceremony that real emergencies always have. Not dramatic, not announced, just the sudden presence of urgency in a space that had been ordinary a moment before. 1347. Ava was in the east corridor with her cart when the radio on Sergeant Boudin's belt, he was passing through toward the training rooms, burst with a transmission that cut through the ambient noise of the building and made both of them stop. "All available personnel, training ground 3. Mass casualty exercise has gone to actual. Repeat, actual. We have 3 down, 1 critical, requesting medical and command response immediately." Boudin's face changed. He grabbed the radio. "Confirm actual. Confirming actual. Live fire accident during demo run. 3 trainees, 1 staff. Request immediate response." Boudin was already moving. Ava left the cart where it was and followed. The training ground 3 was the demolitions range at the southeast perimeter, a dedicated area used for controlled explosive demonstrations, surrounded by berms and blast shields, restricted during active use. The live fire accident had occurred during a breaching demonstration, a charge that had detonated earlier than the sequence called for, catching 2 trainees and 1 instructor in the secondary blast radius, and a 3rd trainee who had taken shrapnel from the shield displacement. By the time Ava and Boudin came through the outer gate, the scene had the particular organized chaos of an emergency that had just started. People in motion, some purposeful, some just responding to the energy of urgency without yet understanding the geometry of what was needed. There were 3 people on the ground. A 4th, the instructor, was mobile but not fully functional. She was moving under her own power, but her left arm was held against her body in a way that suggested the arm was not currently reliable. The first trainee down was conscious, talking, which was good. Left leg, significant bleeding at the thigh. The femoral region, which was not good. Tourniquet required immediately, correctly placed, and it needed to happen in the next 2 minutes, or the conversation between everyone above this question became academic. The second trainee was unconscious. No visible major bleeding, which meant the blast had done something else. Head, internal, the shrapnel that sometimes didn't show on the surface. The third was upright but shaking, with material embedded in the shoulder and the upper arm, and a quality of shock that showed in the eyes before anything else. Ava was on her knees beside the first trainee before Boudin had finished assessing the perimeter. "Hey!" Her hand on his jaw, not gentle but present. "Look at me." He looked at her. "What's your name?" "Teague. Pierce Teague." "Pierce, I've got you. You're going to stay awake. Where do you feel pain?" My leg is—" "I know, I see it. Stay with me." She had his belt off before she finished the sentence. Civilian clothing today, no medical kit, no tourniquet, working with what was present. The belt wasn't ideal. The belt was what existed. She got it above the wound site, pulled it to pressure, looped it, and the kid made a sound she noted without allowing to affect her hands. "Sorry," she said. "Keep talking." "Is it—" He swallowed. "Is it bad?" "It's manageable," she said. Which was true. "If we keep it controlled for the next 8 minutes until the ambulance arrives, you'll be fine." She looked up. "I need a stick. Anything rigid. Pen, tent pole, anything." Solis materialized beside her with a tent stake she'd grabbed from the equipment rack at the perimeter. She handed it without asking. "Smart," Ava said. She twisted the improvised tourniquet, locked it, checked the femoral. The bleeding slowed. She moved. Unconscious trainee. Airway first. Head tilt, chin lift, checking for obstruction. Breathing present, irregular. She pressed fingers to the carotid, counted. Pulse 70, slightly thready. Pupils, she needed light. She looked up and Solis was already there with a phone flashlight. Equal pupils, sluggish response on the left. Head injury. Possible intracranial event. She couldn't do anything about that here, but she could make sure he wasn't moved incorrectly and that his airway stayed open. "Nobody touches him except to hold the airway position," she said loudly enough for the people standing in a semicircle around the scene. "Don't move his head, don't turn him, don't lift him. If he vomits, roll him as a unit, spine stays aligned." The semicircle adjusted. Third trainee. She went to him next. He was talking, which meant his airway was functional. Shrapnel in the shoulder and arm. She looked at the arm wound more carefully. "I need to know if you can move your fingers," she said. He moved them, slowly but present. "Good." She assessed the embedded material. 2 fragments she could see. Possibly more she couldn't. "Are you on any blood thinners? Any medication?" "No." "Any allergies I should know about?" "No." "Okay." She put her hand on his non-injured shoulder, a brief firm pressure. "You're the least critical of the 3. That means I'm going to need you to stay calm and stay still, and I'll come back to you. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. His voice was steadier than she'd expected. She went back to Teague, checked the tourniquet, adjusted. Rael arrived 40 seconds later, coming through the gate at a controlled run. He took in the scene, Ava on her knees with the tourniquet, the unconscious trainee's position, the third trainee upright. And he didn't ask questions. He went to the unconscious trainee and crouched, watching Ava's positioning, mirroring it. "Airways open," she said without looking up. Don't move him. Left pupil sluggish. Got it. Boudin was on the radio calling coordinates to the incoming ambulance. The instructor with the arm injury had made it to the equipment rack and sat down against it, which was the right call. She'd recognized her own limits and removed herself from the geometry of the emergency rather than trying to contribute with diminished capacity. Mercer came through the gate. She stopped. She looked at the scene. Ava Carter on her knees in civilian clothes, managing 3 trauma casualties with improvised equipment, directing the people around her with the specific economy of someone who has run this particular kind of chaos before and knows what the shape of it is and how to move inside it. She stood at the gate for 3 seconds. Then she moved to the perimeter and got on her own radio to coordinate the medical response. The ambulance arrived at 14:03. The paramedics came through the gate and Ava stood and gave a handoff report without preamble. Mechanism of injury, time of injury, interventions performed, current status of each patient. GCS scores, tourniquet placement time, airway management on the unconscious trainee, shrapnel locations on the third. She gave it the way reports get given when they're accurate and complete and built from actual assessment rather than estimated from a distance. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s who had the same quality of controlled efficiency as Ava, listened, nodded, and then looked at her. What's your background? Combat medic, Ava said. Former. Former or not, the paramedic said, the tourniquet placement is right, and the airway positioning saved your unconscious casualty from a secondary aspiration event. She turned back to her team. Good work. Ava stepped back. Around her, the training ground had the particular stillness of a space that has just stopped being an emergency and started being an aftermath. Equipment on the ground, scorch marks on the blast shield, the smell of explosive residue mixing with cold air, a radio crackling somewhere with a status update. 20, maybe 25 people standing in the perimeter, all of them looking at her. Not the way they'd looked at the display rifles on Friday, not the speculative testing look of people watching someone they'd dismissed potentially embarrass themselves. Not the crowd energy of an audience at a performance. The way people look at someone who just did something that mattered. Solis was standing 5 feet away, still holding the phone she'd used for the light. She looked at Ava the way the trainees who come out of the best training cycles look at the instructors who've actually been downrange. Not hero worship, which was useless, but recognition of something real. Boudin stood near the gate with his radio in his hand and the expression of a man who was doing a rapid and uncomfortable revision. Rail was looking at her from the unconscious trainee's position, where he'd stayed to maintain the airway hold until the paramedics took over. His face had none of the revision quality the others had. He'd never needed to revise. But there was something in it now, something that hadn't been there before. A different quality of attention, the look of a man who had suspected and had now been confirmed and was sitting with what that meant. Mercer was at the far edge of the perimeter, still on the radio, but she was watching. Ava looked down at her hands. There was blood on them. Teagues, from the tourniquet application. She hadn't noticed while she was working. She noticed now. She went to the supply station at the equipment rack and found a pack of sterile wipes, and she cleaned her hands methodically, the way she did everything, thoroughly, without wasted motion, with the attention of someone who has learned that small things done correctly prevent large problems later. The wipes went dark. She folded them, disposed of them in the kit bag, and turned. Mercer was standing 3 feet away. She'd come off the radio. Somewhere in the last 2 minutes, she'd crossed the perimeter without Ava noticing, which almost never happened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer said, Teague would have bled out. Probably not if someone else had gotten a tourniquet on him in time. Nobody else was moving toward him, Mercer said. I watched from the gate. You were on your knees before anyone else processed what was happening. Ava looked at her. I'm not trying to compliment you, Mercer said. Her voice was different again from every previous version of it. The performance register, the command register, the carefully controlled register of the meeting room, none of those. This was something else. Quieter, with something in it that sounded almost like difficulty. I'm saying what happened, factually. She paused. You ran toward it. I know how to help in that situation, Ava said. Most people don't. That's not a personal quality. It's a training outcome. Don't do that, Mercer said. Do what? Reduce it. Mercer held her gaze. Don't reduce it to training. There were trained people here. You were the one who moved. Ava looked at the blast shield, at the scorch marks, at the equipment still scattered on the ground. Is Teague going to be okay? She asked. They're saying yes. Mercer paused. The tourniquet held. They'll work on the leg at the hospital, but the paramedic said the placement was… She stopped. Correct. Good, Ava said. She picked up her jacket from the equipment rack where she'd set it before kneeling. You should let Hess's office know about the incident, she said. Given the flag on my file, any event involving me in an operational capacity is probably supposed to be reported. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I'll handle the reporting. Ava nodded and started toward the gate. Carter. She stopped, turned. Mercer stood in the middle of the training ground with the late afternoon light coming in flat over the berms and the smell of the blast still in the air, and she looked at Ava with the specific expression of someone who has arrived, slowly and at some cost, at an understanding they should have had sooner. I'm sorry, she said. For Friday? For the corridor? For… She stopped, started again. For how we handled it. Ava looked at her for a moment. I know, she said. She walked through the gate. Behind her, the training ground settled into its aftermath silence, and the light kept coming in flat over the berms, and Rael stood near the gate and watched her cross the gravel toward the facility and thought about what it meant to carry something for years, and to never once put it down, not even when you probably should have, and to be that steady about it that the weight became invisible until a moment like this one, when it suddenly became the most visible thing in the room. He went back inside. In the east corridor, Ava's cart sat exactly where she'd left it. The mop had dried. The cart sat in the east corridor for 40 minutes before anyone thought to move it. It was Solis who did it, in the end. She came back through the building after the ambulance left and found it sitting there with the dried mop and the supply caddy still stocked and the wheel slightly canted against the baseboard. And she stood looking at it for a moment with the particular feeling of someone who has just watched something significant happen and doesn't yet have language for it. Then she wheeled it carefully to the supply room and parked it against the wall and stood in the doorway for another few seconds before she went back to the barracks. Ava was already at the hospital by then. She'd driven straight there from the facility, still in the clothes with Teague's blood on the sleeve. She hadn't noticed until she was on the highway and the light caught it differently. And she'd sat in the parking structure for 3 minutes before going in. Not from hesitation, but from the same instinct that makes people stand outside a room before entering it when they don't want to bring a certain energy inside. Her father was awake. She came through the door and he looked at her, and then at the sleeve, and his face did something complicated. Training accident, she said before he could ask. Not mine. Casualties? 3. 1 critical, stable now. 1 serious, stable. 1 walking wounded. She sat in the chair. I was on scene. He was quiet for a moment. Were you the first responder? Yes. He looked at the sleeve again. Tourniquet. Femoral adjacent. Belt improvisation. Time from injury? Under 2 minutes to application. He nodded slowly. Not pride exactly. He'd never performed pride straightforwardly. It wasn't in his register, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man whose standards are high enough that meeting them is genuinely worth noting. Good, he said. The paramedic said the placement was correct. The placement was correct because you placed it. He shifted against the pillows. How's the kid? He'll keep the leg. That's what the paramedic said. Then it was a good day's work. She looked at the window. The evening had come in while she was driving. The city was dark outside, the parking structure lights reflected in the glass. Mercer apologized, she said. Her father didn't say anything. In front of the training ground, she said, after it was over. Not a formal thing, just said she was sorry for how it was handled. What did you say? I said I know. He considered that. Was that enough? For now, she said. I don't know what enough looks like yet. He reached out and put his hand over hers. His grip was still strong, which continued to surprise her every time. This persistence of physical presence in a body that was failing in other ways. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat that way for a while in the quiet of the room, with the monitors doing their soft work, and the corridor sounds filtering through the door, and neither of them needed to fill it with words, which was one of the specific gifts of having known someone your whole life. The incident report was filed at 800 the following morning. Mercer wrote it herself, which was noted by Dake when it crossed his desk, because senior training officers typically delegated incident documentation. She wrote it accurately, which meant it reflected what had actually happened at the demolitions range, including a detailed account of who had responded and how and with what outcome. She included Ava's interventions with clinical specificity, tourniquet placement, airway management, patient assessment, handoff report to EMS, and she submitted it without softening the implication of any of it. It went up the command chain and it reached Hess's office by 0930. Hess called Mercer at 10:15. "I read the incident report," he said. "Yes, sir." "You wrote it yourself." "I did." "Walk me through your reasoning." Mercer was in her office with the door closed. She'd slept poorly again, which was becoming a pattern, and her coffee was on the desk, untouched because she'd poured it and forgotten about it, and it was cold now. "My reasoning is that the report reflects what happened," she said. "A training accident occurred. 3 casualties resulted. The individual who provided the most significant initial medical response was Ava Carter, who is listed in our facility records as contracted maintenance staff. The report accurately identifies who did what. And the implication for her personnel designation is a downstream consequence of accurate reporting," Mercer said. "I can't report an incident accurately and simultaneously omit the fact that the person who ran the triage is classified in our system as a janitor." A pause from Hess's end. "No," he said. "You can't." "So that's my reasoning." Another pause. "The oversight review on her file is still in process. We have 3 command authorities who need to sign off before the classification tiers below the top level can be adjusted." "I understand that." "The incident report may accelerate that timeline." "I understand that too," Mercer said. "I filed it accurately." Hess was quiet for a moment. She could hear something in the background of wherever he was. The particular ambient sound of a large government office, the kind of sound that meant people moving and phones and the constant low-grade machinery of institutional bureaucracy. "Captain Mercer," he said. "Sir, the background check you ran on Friday night, the one that triggered the notification protocol." He paused. "In the 4 days since then, what has your assessment of the situation at Raven Point been?" She thought about it. "My assessment is that we have a significant asset operating in an unofficial capacity in our facility, and that we have been handling that asset in a manner that reflects poorly on our institutional judgment. Specifically, I publicly humiliated her in front of 50 personnel," Mercer said. "I organized what amounted to a series of tests designed to expose her as a fraud in front of an audience, without any information about who I was dealing with. I made assumptions about her capability based on her job title, and I performed those assumptions in the most visible way possible." She paused, and then she responded to a mass casualty event with the kind of training and calm that my best instructors would struggle to match. Another pause. "So my assessment is that we have a serious institutional problem, and it starts with me." Silence from Hess's end. "I see," he said. "I expect the full review will reflect that," Mercer said. "I'm not going to try to shape it differently." Hess took a breath. "I'll be in contact about the file review. Expect movement on that by end of week." He ended the call. Mercer looked at the cold coffee. She picked it up and drank it anyway. The facility had a different quality by Thursday. Not transformed. Institutions don't transform in 4 days. They shift. They adjust. They begin the slow process of revising the story they tell about themselves. But the quality of attention had changed. Ava noticed it in the small things. The way Boudin nodded at her in the corridor. Not the absent acknowledgement of someone registering the maintenance staff, but the direct nod of one professional to another. The way the trainees in the East Wing cleared space when she came through with the cart, rather than walking around her like she was furniture. Solis said good morning to her every day now, making brief eye contact, the kind that meant something rather than the kind that meant nothing. Stroud stopped her on Thursday morning with a folder. "Training syllabus review," he said. "I'm adding a supplemental section on hasty casualty assessment for the next rotation, based on the demo range incident." He held the folder out. "I'd like your input before I finalize it." She looked at the folder. "I'm maintenance staff. You're the only person in this facility who's actually managed that kind of triage under pressure in a real environment, he said. The syllabus review doesn't require a title. She took the folder. Later in the supply room, she read through it with a cleaning cloth in her other hand that she'd forgotten to put down. The syllabus was solid in structure. Stroud was thorough. She'd already understood that about him. But it was built from textbook sources and the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from reading incident reports rather than being in them. It knew the theory precisely and the practice approximately, which was the gap that killed people. She used a pencil she found in her cleaning caddy to make notes in the margins. Small ones, specific. The kind of adjustment that comes from the difference between the procedure as written and the procedure as it actually runs when there are 3 people on the ground and no kit, and the light is wrong, and everyone around you is making decisions based on what they learned in a classroom. She left the folder on Stroud's desk at the end of her shift. He found it at 700 the next morning, read the margin notes, and stood in his office for several minutes before he sat down. Friday came with the federal review completed. Hess arrived at Raven Point at 1100, earlier than expected, with his assistant and a second person from the oversight office, a woman named Calder who handled classification reviews, and who had, based on her posture and the way she carried the legal case, done this enough times that it was fully ordinary to her. The meeting was in the same oval table room as before. Same chairs. Mercer, Rael, Dake, Stroud this time. Ava across from Mercer, same position. Calder opened the case and distributed physical folders to each person at the table. The folders were tabbed. The first tab was labeled Summary of Record, Declassified Extract. Below that, Career Overview. Below that, several more tabs that Calder indicated with a flat palm. The full classified file remains behind its access tier, she said. What you're receiving is an extract that has been reviewed and approved for distribution to cleared personnel at this facility. It covers the career record in sufficient detail for the purpose of this meeting. Ava looked at the folder in front of her. She didn't open it. Do you want a moment to review it before we proceed? Calder asked her. No, Ava said. I know what's in it. Calder nodded and looked at the others. Then I'll walk through the highlights and we can proceed to discussion. She was precise about it and unhurried, which Rael appreciated. Some people in oversight positions performed their authority by expanding into time they didn't need. Calder used exactly the time required and not more. Captain Ava Carter, enlisted at 18, advanced through the training pipeline faster than standard track. Not because of connections, the record made clear, but because of assessment scores and demonstrated performance that kept pushing her toward more intensive instruction. Special Operations Selection at 23. The selection process was referenced but not detailed, the specific program remaining behind its classification tier. But the fact of selection and the training outcome was in the extract. 12 years of operational service. The decorations were listed by type, without the specific actions attached. The actions were still classified. But the decorations themselves were a vocabulary that people in this room could read. The people at the table read them, and the room got quieter as the list went on. Rael turned a page, kept his face neutral, which cost him something. Stroud had stopped taking notes. Mercer read without moving. She'd seen the summary before. Seeing the extract, more detail, cleaner context, was something else. She sat with it. The mission status noted in the record set, Calder said, reaching the section near the end. The presumed deceased notation. The extract provides the framework without the operational details, which remain classified. She paused. Captain Carter was listed as KYA, following a mission that resulted in asset compromise and extraction failure. The notation was made in good faith based on available information. She was subsequently recovered by a joint element 14 months later. Calder looked at her folder. The conditions of that 14-month period are not in the extract. Nobody asked. They understood that not in the extract meant classified for reasons that are not administrative. Mercer looked at Ava. Ava was looking at the table. Following recovery, Calder continued, Captain Carter completed a medical and psychological evaluation process, was found fit for return to service, and was offered a return to operational assignment. She declined and submitted voluntary separation paperwork, citing compassionate circumstance, specifically the medical situation of an immediate family member. She closed her folder. Separation was approved and processed. The file was flagged for access control based on the classified nature of the operation she'd been involved in, not based on any disciplinary action. Her record has no adverse notations. Silence. Dake, who had pulled the original background check and who had been quietly running the numbers since Monday, looked at his folder for a long moment. The civilian background check at time of hire, he said, the one that came back clean, is under review, Calder said, separately. The private contractor that performed the vetting used a record set that was, as a practical matter, incomplete. Because the relevant service history is behind a classification tier the contractor didn't have access to. That's a gap in the vetting process for facilities like this one, not a specific error by the contractor, and not anything Captain Carter did. She paused. She did not falsify her application. She listed no military service. She was not asked directly about military service in the standard civilian contractor application. She wasn't asked, Stroud said. Correct. Stroud looked at his folder. So she applied, Mercer said slowly, for a maintenance position, listed no military background because she was not required to, passed a background check that cleared her civilian record, and we hired her. She paused. And the rest we created ourselves. Calder looked at her. That's an accurate summary, Tom. After Calder's portion concluded, Hess took over the table, and the conversation shifted from record review to what happened next, which was the part Ava had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The facility has a decision to make, Hess said, which is ultimately a command decision and not an oversight one. Captain Carter is contracted maintenance staff. Her contract is legitimate, her presence here is legitimate, and if nothing changes, she remains in that capacity for as long as the contract runs. He looked at Mercer. What the facility does with the information we now all have is up to the facility. Mercer looked at Ava. I offered you an instructional role on Monday. You did, Ava said. That offer stands. Formally, now. What does the role look like? Ava asked. Stroud put together a framework, Mercer said. She nodded to Stroud. He laid out the structure, mate. Not in the polished language of a formal proposal, because Stroud's proposals were always working documents first and presentations second, which was one of his genuine strengths. CQB fundamentals for the advanced rotation. Weapons handling supplemental instruction. Casualty management. Ava's margin notes had essentially built that module, Stroud said without embarrassment. Land navigation and tactical decision-making at the intermediate level. Formally contracted, he said. Appropriate designation. We'd need to negotiate the hours to fit your current obligations. My father's appointments are Mondays and Thursdays, she said. Mornings. We'd work around that, Mercer said. Ava looked at the table, then at the folder she hadn't opened, then at the window. What happens to the maintenance contract? The question surprised some of them. We'd transition you out of it, Mercer said. A new contractor would take the cleaning responsibilities. The East Corridor needs daily mopping during the wet season, Ava said. Whoever you bring in needs to understand that the drain in the north end backs up if it's not cleared before shift. There's a specific tool for it in the supply room, third shelf. Mercer stared at her for a moment. I'll make sure they're briefed, she said carefully. Ava nodded. Then I'll consider the instructional role. Consider, Hess said, not quite smiling, but close. I have one condition, Ava said. What's that? Mercer asked. The trainees get accurate instruction. Not managed instruction, not comfortable instruction. If I see something being taught incorrectly, I say so. If I think a trainee is going to get themselves killed with a specific skill gap, I address it directly. I don't work around institutional sensitivities if the institutional sensitivity is going to put someone on the ground. The room was quiet for a moment. Done, Mercer said. That's it? Stroud said. He'd been expecting something more complicated. That's it, Ava said. Time. The formal transition took 2 weeks to process. Contract modifications, designation changes, the appropriate clearance tier attached to her role so that the classified elements of her background could inform her instructional approach without being disclosed to trainees. Hess's office ran the classification piece. Calder drafted the access parameters. Dake updated the facility records with the efficiency of a man who had decided that accurate records were better than convenient ones. On the first Monday of December, Ava Carter walked into Building C's second-floor classroom without a cart. 24 trainees looked at her. She was in the same dark slacks and gray long sleeve, which she'd decided were perfectly functional for instruction and saw no reason to change. She had a folder, Stroud's CQB syllabus with her margin notes incorporated, and a marker for the whiteboard. "I'm not going to introduce myself with a biography," she said. "You either already know the broad shape of it, or you'll know it later, or it won't matter because what you learn here will matter more than where I learned it." She set the folder on the table. "I'm going to tell you one thing up front, and then we'll get to work." 24 people waiting. The difference between a trained response and a correct response is smaller than you think when you're in a classroom and much larger than you think when you're not. My job is to close that gap. Your job is to take the discomfort of being corrected seriously, because I'm going to correct you, and the reason it's uncomfortable is usually the reason it matters. She paused. "Any questions before we start?" One hand near the back. Trainee named Ortega, whom she recognized from the demo range perimeter. "The CQB session, ma'am. The Kill House run. Was that the first time you'd—" He stopped, reframed. "How long have you been doing that?" "Clearing rooms?" "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him. "Long enough that I stopped counting and started making sure the people around me knew how." She opened the folder. "First session, sector coverage and angle discipline. We're going to do this on paper first, and then I'm going to walk you through why the paper version will get you hurt, and then we'll go to the kill house." Rael watched the first session through the window in the corridor. Not the whole thing, just enough to confirm what he'd expected, which was that she was good at it. Not in the smooth way of people who've taught so long the roughness is gone, but in the direct way of someone who is teaching exactly what they know and exactly why it matters, with no performance layered on top of it. She stopped a trainee named Park mid-exercise and corrected his muzzle discipline with the same precision she'd used on the weapons identification in the armory corridor. Specific, accurate, patient enough to be understood, and direct enough not to waste time. Park did it again. Correctly. She moved on. Rael went back to his office and sat down and thought about the first morning he'd seen her, the way she'd moved through the mess hall with the cart and the gray uniform, the economy of it, the quality of attention she'd had even then. Not dormant, not suppressed, just present in a different form than the one that was now visible. He thought about 14 months. The file hadn't specified. Calder had said 14 months without saying what 14 months had meant. And the room had understood that the silence around it was not administrative, and nobody had asked, and he hadn't either. But he thought about it. The way you think about something you can't know directly, but can approximate through the weight of what someone carries, through the quality of their stillness, through the fact that they applied for a maintenance job at a tactical training facility and cleaned floors for 6 months with the posture of someone who has accepted a situation that most people would have found intolerable and found in it, if not peace, then at least a kind of function. He thought about that. He went to the mess hall at lunch. Ava was there, at a side table, alone, eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone that he suspected was not recreational. She looked up when he sat down across from her and then looked back at the phone, which was close enough to an invitation as she generally offered. "How was the morning session?" he asked. "Productive," she said. Ortega's question. She glanced up. "I was in the corridor," he said unapologetically. She set the phone down. He wanted to know how long I'd been clearing rooms. "What did you tell him?" "Long enough that I stopped counting." "That's a non-answer." "I know." She picked up the sandwich. He didn't need an answer. He needed me to start the class. "You could have given him a number." "I could have given him a number that would have made it about me." She looked at him. "The number doesn't help him clear rooms better. The technique does." Rael considered that. "You're going to be a frustrating instructor for people who want biography." "Good," she said. "Biography is a distraction." She looked at the phone again. "The hospital called this morning. His numbers were better than Wednesday. They adjusted the timeline again." The shift was seamless, from the classroom to this, the thing underneath all of it. "Which direction?" Rael asked carefully. She looked up at him, something in her face that she didn't try to manage. "They don't know," she said. "It goes both ways, good days, bad days. The trajectory is—" She stopped. "The trajectory is what it is. But today was a better number." "That's good," he said. Yes, she said. She ate the sandwich. He sat with her while she finished it, and they didn't talk much, and that was fine. Set. Mercer found Ava in the kill house 2 days later. Not during a session. The afternoon rotation had ended at 1600, and it was 1715, and the kill house was empty, and Mercer had come to check that the secondary access door had been properly secured after a trainee had reported it sticking. She came through the main entry, and Ava was in the second room, standing in the doorway threshold with her arms at her sides, looking at the geometry of the space. Sorry, Mercer said. I didn't know anyone was in here. I'm not doing anything, Ava said. I was just looking. Mercer looked at the room. 2 target silhouettes, reset after the afternoon session. A simulated civilian marker in the corner. The angles of the door frame. The civilian positioning, Ava said. In the current setup, the civilian is placed in the northeast corner, which means any entry from the primary door puts the trainee in a sightline conflict between the armed target and the civilian on the draw. She paused. It's a good training scenario. Harder than it looks. Is it set up wrong? No, it's set up to create a decision problem. She stopped. I was thinking about how I'd adjust the approach. And? Entry from a lower angle. Use the wall to push the geometry. Force the armed target into a position where the civilian is out of the line. She paused. You sacrifice speed for accuracy. In a real environment, sometimes that's the trade. Mercer stood in the doorway for a moment. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. The 14 months. She said it simply, without the hedging that would have made it worse. You don't have to answer. I'm not asking as your commanding officer. I'm not asking for the file. I'm not asking for anything reportable. I'm asking... She paused. I read the extract. I know what the notation means. I've written enough incident reports to understand what the language around certain classified sections is covering. Ava looked at the civilian marker in the corner. Then you know what it means, she said. I know what category of thing it means, Mercer said. I don't know how you came through it and ended up here, in this building, with a mop. A long pause. I needed to do something useful, Ava said. While I still had my father, and I needed the something useful to not be in an environment that required me to be, she paused, fully present, all the time, in the way that operational environments require. She looked at the doorframe. Cleaning is good. It's contained. It has a clear outcome. You do the thing, and the floor is clean, and you can see exactly what you've accomplished, and it doesn't ask anything of you that you can't give. But you could give more than that, Mercer said. I could, Ava said, but choosing not to for a period isn't the same as not being able to. She turned and looked at Mercer. I knew what I was. The building didn't change that. Your assumptions didn't change that. The demonstrations on Friday didn't create it. She paused. I was that before I walked in. I was that while I was here, and I'll be that after. The audience is irrelevant. Mercer looked at her. I owe you more than an apology in a parking lot, she said. You owe me accurate instruction conditions, Ava said, which you've provided. A pause. The rest of it is over. It's not over for me, Mercer said. She said it plainly, without the performance quality that had dominated their early interactions. What I did in that corridor, with the crowd, the testing, She stopped. I set that up as a spectacle. I wanted to prove something in front of people, and the thing I was trying to prove was that you were less than your badge said you were. And I was wrong about it before I had any information, because I looked at the badge and the uniform and the cart, and I made a decision about what I was looking at. She paused. That's mine to carry, not asking you to absolve it. Ava looked at her for a moment. I've been underestimated my whole career, she said. Not just here. Every environment I entered before anyone knew my record. The assumption runs in one direction. It gets corrected eventually. But it always runs that direction first. She paused. You were faster than most to correct it once you had information. That matters. Not fast enough to prevent it. No, Ava said, but fast enough to handle it well afterward. Those are different things, and both matter. She looked at the kill house room, the civilian marker, the target geometry. I've had commanders who doubled down once they were wrong, who buried the correction under more pressure so they didn't have to acknowledge the original error. A pause. You didn't do that. Mercer was quiet. You filed the incident report accurately, Ava said. That was a choice. You could have written it differently. She turned toward the primary exit. That's the version of you I can work with. She moved through the door frame, using the wall angle the way she'd just described. Lower, controlled, a habit so deep it happened outside training context. Mercer stood in the second room of the kill house and listened to her footsteps cross the first room and exit through the main door. And she stood with what she'd said and what she hadn't said, and the specific, lasting quality of being seen clearly by someone you'd badly misjudged. What? The following Tuesday, at 1800, with the facility settling into evening and the last training rotation finishing its debrief, Ava's phone rang. She was in the supply room doing what she still did at the end of each day. Old habit or genuine preference, or the simple fact that clean space is clean space regardless of what else is true. Running a quick check of the supply inventory before logging out. She saw the screen, not the hospital's main line, her father's room line, which he only used when he wanted to reach her directly and not through the nursing station. She answered immediately. "Hey," his voice. "Hey." She set down the clipboard. "Everything okay?" "Fine," he said. "I'm fine. I wanted to tell you something." "Tell me." A pause. She heard him adjust against the pillows, the sound of it, familiar now as ambient noise. "The nurse came in today," he said. "The young one, Priya's replacement on Tuesdays. She said she overheard two soldiers talking in the lobby. From your facility." He paused. "They were talking about the woman instructor, said she's the best they've seen, said she ran a casualty response on the demo range that saved a trainee's leg." Another pause. "They didn't know her name, just called her the instructor." Ava was quiet. "I didn't say anything," he said. "I just listened." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it for months. Something lighter, something that sat above the weight of what he was dealing with. "I thought you should know." "Okay," she said. "You're not going to say anything else about it?" "What would I say?" He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's my girl," he said, and she could hear the smile in it, the specific warmth of a man who has spent decades being proud of something he rarely found the exact right words for. She stood in the supply room with the phone against her ear and the familiar smell of cleaning supplies around her and the building going quiet in the way buildings do at the end of a working day, and she felt something that she hadn't had the space to feel in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief, something closer to the sensation of a weight that's been carried long enough that you've forgotten it as weight, shifting very slightly, just enough to remind you it's there, and that it can, under the right conditions, be set down. Not yet, but eventually. "I'll be there at 7, she said. "I'll be here," he said. She ended the call. She finished the supply inventory. She turned off the light. She drove to the hospital at 7 and stayed until 9:30, and her father was in one of his good moods, which meant he was opinionated about everything and didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to talk about the training syllabus she'd described on Sunday, specifically the CQB section, specifically the part about angle discipline under time pressure. And he had opinions, which he delivered with the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades thinking about how people move in dangerous spaces. "The problem with teaching angle discipline in isolation," he said, "is that trainees learn it as a static concept. Cover the angle, clear the angle, move. But the angle changes when you move. Most people don't internalize that until someone shows them." "That's exactly what I'm building the second session around," she said. "You're starting with static and moving to dynamic?" "Yes." "Good." He shifted. "Don't let them rush the transition. The temptation is to move to dynamic fast because it feels more real. But if they don't own the static version, they'll drop it under pressure." "I know, Dad. I'm just saying." "I know you're just saying." He looked at her with the sideways amusement that had been his primary expression for most of her life. "You sound like you did when you were 17 and I was telling you how to hold a rifle. I was right then too." "You were right eventually," he said, "after about 300 rounds. She smiled, an actual smile, the unguarded kind that she reserved for this room and nowhere else. And he smiled back, and for a few minutes the room was just a room, and they were just two people who had known each other long enough to sit in the easy comfort of shared history. Then the monitor above the bed made a sound it didn't usually make, and a nurse came in, and the moment became something else. The respiratory episode lasted 40 minutes and resolved without emergency intervention, which the attending physician explained to Ava in the corridor outside room 412 with the careful tone of someone who has learned to give honest information and compassionate framing simultaneously without conflating the two. "He's stable," Dr. Anwar said. "We've adjusted the oxygen flow. This is consistent with the progression we discussed in October." She paused. "I want to be direct with you about the timeline." "Please," Ava said. "We're looking at weeks now rather than months." She held Ava's gaze. "I know we've revised the timeline several times. This revision is based on today's presentation in combination with the trend data from the last 6 weeks. His baseline is declining faster than the previous rate." Ava stood in the corridor with the hospital sounds around her and the fluorescent light doing what fluorescent lights do and said, "Is he in pain?" "We're managing it well," Anwar said. "He's not comfortable in the way a healthy person is comfortable, but he's not suffering in a way that the current protocol isn't addressing." "Is he lucid?" "Entirely." A pause. "He's been asking for you." She went back in. He was awake, the oxygen line repositioned, his color slightly different than it had been an hour ago. Still him, still the same eyes, but the episode had cost something, and the room knew it. "Weeks," he said when she sat down. Not a question. "That's what she said." He nodded, the nod of a man who has run the numbers himself and is not surprised by the result. "I figured." He looked at the window. "I want to talk to you about something." "Okay, when this is done." He turned and looked at her directly, which was his way of indicating that what came next was not negotiable. "You're going to be tempted to go back inside." "Inside." "Active service, some version of it, they'll offer. Hess's office is already positioning for it. I can read the shape of what you're describing. The oversight review, the file access. They're not doing that to clean up administrative records. They're doing it because they want access to you again." He paused. "And you're going to be tempted to say yes because after this, after I'm gone, you're going to need something to do with all of it." She looked at him. "I know you," he said. "I've known you your whole life. And what you do with grief is work. You go in deeper, you take the harder assignment. You turn the pain into fuel, and you spend it in the field because the field doesn't ask you to feel things. It asks you to perform things, and that's easier." He stopped, took a breath through the line. "And I'm asking you not to do that." "Dad, I'm asking you," he said again, not telling. "You're a grown woman with a better service record than mine, and I don't have the standing to tell you anything, but I'm asking." She was quiet. "Stay at Raven Point," he said. "Teach. Spend the months after I'm gone building something that stays built. What you put into those trainees, that lasts, that multiplies." His voice was rough with the effort of saying it clearly. "I spent 31 years doing the work, and I don't regret it. But the things I taught, the people I taught, those are what I think about now, not the operations, not the record." He paused. "The faces of people who learned something that kept them alive." She held his hand. Didn't say anything for a while. "Okay," she said, finally. "Okay, you heard me, or okay, you'll do it?" "Okay, I'll stay at Raven Point," she said. He relaxed. Not all at once. It was the slow release of something he'd been holding for a while, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it left. "Good," he said. She stayed until 11. Then she drove home in the dark and sat in the parking lot of her apartment building for a few minutes before she went inside, and she did not fall apart, which was both her greatest strength and the thing about herself she was most uncertain about. She was at Raven Point at 700. Not because her shift started then. The new contract had more flexible hours than the maintenance rotation, but because she'd been awake since 4 and the building was useful to her in the way that purposeful spaces are useful to people who don't do well with unstructured time. Rael was in the north corridor at 7:15, which didn't surprise her. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some," she said. "Episode last night. He's stable." Rael looked at her. "Do you need the morning?" "No." She meant it. "I need the morning session, the static to dynamic transition for angle discipline. I've been thinking about how to run it since 2 a.m. "Of course you have," he said, not unkindly. "You told me to stay," she said. "After." She said it without preamble because Rael was one of the few people in the building who didn't require preamble. He said, "Stay at Raven Point, teach." Rael was quiet. "He said the things you teach last longer than the things you do," she said. "That what gets passed forward is what matters." "He sounds right," Rael said. "He usually is," she said. "It's irritating." Rael almost smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd stay." She paused. "I meant it." "Good." He looked at the corridor. "The trainees are going to be better for it. The ones coming through after this rotation too, because Solis is going to become an instructor eventually, and she's already learning differently than she was 2 weeks ago. That's what your father is describing. It compounds." She looked at him. "When do you rotate out?" "End of month," he said. "Back to my home unit." "And after that?" He paused. "I put in a request. Visiting instructor position. There's a slot at Raven Point for next spring." She held his gaze. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I want to see how the program develops." He paused. "And you're going to need someone who can run the land navigation module, because based on what I've seen of your margins on Stroud's syllabus, you have opinions about land navigation instruction that are going to require backup." "I have justified opinions," she said. "I'm sure they're very justified. You'll still need backup." She was quiet for a moment. Then something moved across her face that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it, the particular expression of someone who is not entirely comfortable with being cared for and is making an internal adjustment toward accepting it. "Spring," she said. "Spring," he confirmed. December moved through Raven Point the way December moves through working military facilities, with the particular combination of operational continuity and holiday-adjacent energy that produces both excellent training sessions and a lot of bad mess hall food. The second rotation concluded and the third began, which brought 27 new trainees who knew Ava Carter only as the instructor, and who had heard enough from the previous rotation to arrive with something Ava found both useful and faintly uncomfortable: expectation. She addressed it in the first session. "You've heard things about me," she said to 27 faces. "Some of them are probably accurate. Some are probably inflated because that's what happens to stories when they travel." She set her folder on the table. "None of it matters in this room. What matters in this room is what you learn and whether you can execute it under pressure. The first time I see you do something that would get you or your partner killed, I'm going to stop everything and we're going to fix it. The first time I see you do something correctly, properly correct, not just technically correct, but with the judgment that makes it actually work, I'm going to notice that too." She paused. "That's how this goes. Any questions?" Boom bas tam ikam. Silence for a moment. Then a trainee in the second row, young, probably 22, with the alert stillness of someone who processes before they speak, raised his hand. "What's the difference between technically correct and properly correct?" She looked at him. "What's your name?" "Trainee Vasquez." "Vasquez. Good question. Technically correct is the procedure as written performed in the sequence specified. Properly correct is the procedure as written performed in the sequence specified, with the adjustments that the specific environment requires that the procedure can anticipate." She paused. "The procedure assumes a clean room with adequate light, a non-moving threat, and no civilian complexity. You will never operate in that room. So technically correct is where you start, and properly correct is what you're building toward." She opened the folder. "We'll spend the first week establishing technically correct. Then I'm going to start breaking your assumptions." Itos amtin. Vasquez wrote something down. "Good sign." Stroud found her after the third session of the second week and asked if he could sit in on the angle discipline module. "Why?" she asked. "Because 3 trainees in my advanced section are doing something with their entry geometry that I can't identify the source of," he said. "And I think it came from your CQB session last rotation." "It did," she said. "Is it causing problems?" "It's causing me to revise my instruction," he said. "I'd like to understand it better." She looked at him. "The door entry angle I'm teaching reduces the approach speed by about 15%. In the short term, it looks like hesitation, which is why it registers as a problem. In the medium term, it reduces fratricide exposure by eliminating the sightline conflict through the door frame before the entry. She paused. Boudin's instruction was teaching speed as the primary metric. I changed the primary metric to safety margin, which conflicts with the standard evaluation criteria, Stroud said. The standard evaluation criteria was written by someone who prioritized speed, she said. Speed is important. It is not more important than not shooting your partner. She met his gaze. If the evaluation criteria creates that hierarchy, the evaluation criteria needs to be looked at. Stroud was quiet. I'll sit in, he said. Bring the evaluation sheet, she said. We can talk about what's worth changing. He did. They worked on the evaluation criteria for 2 evenings in the week that followed, in the small conference room off the armory wing, with Boudin joining on the second evening because he'd heard about the conversation and wanted to be part of it rather than around it. It was the most functional disagreement Ava had had at Raven Point. 3 people with different amounts of experience and different starting assumptions working towards something better than any of them had individually. Nobody performed. Nobody protected territory. They looked at the criteria, found the places where the metrics were driving behavior that the criteria hadn't intended, and revised. By the end of the second evening, they had a document that was better than what they'd started with. I'll take it to Mercer, Stroud said. She'll want to review it, Ava said. Obviously. He paused. She'll probably approve it. Maybe. She stood and gathered the papers. Or she'll have changes. Either way, it's better for the trainees. You're not going to advocate for it? She looked at him. I just spent 2 evenings building the argument. The document advocates. She picked up her jacket. Stroud, you're a better instructor than you were a month ago. Do you know that? He looked surprised. You are. The revision request came from you. The evaluation criteria conversation came from you. You're building toward what the trainees need instead of toward what the manual says. She paused. That's what good instruction is. I just wanted to say it. He stood with that for a moment. Thank you, he said. It came out more plainly than he intended, which meant it was genuine. Go file the document, she said, and left. Miss Leonard Carter died on a Thursday morning in the second week of January in room 412 of Callaway Veterans Medical Center with his daughter beside him. It was not dramatic. It was not peaceful in the movie sense of peaceful. It was the real version, which is harder and quieter and more private than the version stories usually describe. The gradual departure of a person from a body that has been holding on longer than either of them expected. In a room with monitors and the sound of the ventilation system and the corridor outside and a January morning coming through the window that was gray and dry and still. Ava held his hand. She told him about the angle discipline module, about Vasquez's question, about the evaluation criteria revision and the 2 evenings with Stroud and Boudin. She told him about Solis, who had asked in the 4th session whether she'd consider a supplemental session on trauma assessment, and about Rael's spring request. She didn't know how much he heard. She told him anyway. At 8:47, the monitors changed, and Dr. Anwar came in and did the things that needed to be done, and Ava sat in the chair beside the bed and did not move for a while. Priya came in at some point and put a hand on her shoulder briefly and said something quiet and then left, which was the right call. Ava stayed until 1100, and then she got up and collected the chair, her own chair, the one she'd brought from home in October, and folded it and carried it out to the truck. She drove to Raven Point, not because she had a session. She didn't. The Thursday sessions were afternoon only. She drove there because she didn't know where else to go, and the building was what she had, and her father had told her to stay, and so she stayed. She sat in the parking lot for a while. Then she went inside. Mercer was the first person she encountered in the main corridor coming from the direction of the command wing. She stopped when she saw Ava's face. She didn't ask. She looked, and she understood from what she saw, and she said, I'm sorry. Thank you, Ava said. Do you need? I need to be here, Ava said. I just need to be here. Mercer nodded. No follow-up, no management of the situation, no institutional response, just okay. There's coffee in the command wing, she said. The real kind, not the mess hall kind. Dake brought in a proper machine in November. Help yourself. Thank you, Ava said again. She went and got coffee. She sat in the small conference room off the armory wing, the one where she and Stroud and Boudin had worked on the evaluation criteria. And she sat with the coffee and with the particular quality of silence that comes after a long anticipation ends. She didn't cry. That would come later, privately, in the apartment, and it wouldn't look the way grief looks in the stories, and that was fine. She sat with the coffee and with her father's voice in her head saying the things he'd said over the months, about the trainees, about what lasts, about warriors going home to the people they love. And she let it be what it was, which was loss that was also, underneath the loss, a kind of completion. He'd had 31 years. He'd had a daughter who was there. He'd had room 412 with a chair she'd brought from home and a nurse who knew his name and a facility full of soldiers who would eventually, through the compounding effect of instruction, be better at keeping themselves and each other alive, partly because of who she'd been shaped by. It wasn't comfort, exactly, but it was true. And she had always functioned better with what was true than with what was comfortable. Hess called on a Friday. She'd been expecting it, not necessarily that week, but eventually, and the call arrived with the particular timing of a person who has waited for what they considered an appropriate interval. "My condolences about your father," he said, which she accepted without comment. "What's the purpose of the call?" she asked. "I'll be direct," he said. "There are operational opportunities that your current classification and skill set would support. 2 of them are domestic advisory roles, not field assignments. Significant impact, appropriate compensation, aligned with your experience." He paused. "I wanted to ensure you were aware they existed." "I'm aware they exist," she said. I'm staying at Raven Point." A pause. "That's a firm no?" "That's a firm no on the operational opportunities," she said. "If the Oversight Office wants to maintain a relationship with Raven Point that involves resources or coordination for the instructional program, I'm available for that conversation, but I'm staying here." "Can I ask why?" She thought about her father's voice, about the faces of people who learned something that kept them alive, about Vasquez writing something down in the first session, and Solis asking about trauma assessment, and the slow daily work of building something that would outlast her ability to be in the field. "Because the work here compounds," she said, "and I've decided that matters more right now." Hess was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "The offer remains open if your circumstances change." "Understood," she said. She ended the call. The spring rotation began in March, which was when Rael arrived. He came on a Tuesday, in the same unannounced way he did everything, and found Ava running a land navigation session with the 3rd week of trainees on the field behind the south building. He stood at the perimeter and watched for a few minutes. She was in the middle of the group, compass in hand, explaining the difference between magnetic and grid north in a way that made it obvious she found the confusion on their faces instructive rather than frustrating. "You're off by 18 degrees, she told a trainee named Huang, "which sounds small until you're 12 kilometers out." "How did you see that?" Huang asked. "Because you held the compass correctly and then looked at the terrain and made an adjustment based on what you expected to see rather than what the compass told you." She handed it back. "Trust the instrument. The terrain will confirm it, not override it." Huang looked at the compass again, then at the terrain. Something settled in his expression. "Do it again," she said. He did it again. Rael stayed at the perimeter until the session ended, and when the trainees filtered back toward the building, he crossed the field toward her. She'd seen him coming. She always saw things coming, and waited. "Navigation module looks good," he said. "It's the 2nd time through. The first rotation I made mistakes." She pocketed the compass. "I was teaching the instrument before the decision-making. Wrong order." "And now?" "Decision-making first, instrument as the tool. Different result." He fell in beside her, walking back toward the building. "How are you?" "Better than January," she said. "Different than before January." "Different how?" She thought about it honestly. "Lighter, in some ways. I didn't expect that." She paused. "He took a lot of weight with him, not the bad kind. The kind you carry for someone because you love them and you want to carry it so they don't have to." She looked at the field. "That's done now. He doesn't need me to carry it anymore." "And the other weight?" Rael asked. She knew what he meant. The 14 months, the file, The things Calder had covered with careful language about classified periods. Still there, she said. That one doesn't go anywhere. You just get better at distributing it. He nodded. What's the land navigation module look like? He asked. Where do you want me? Day 3, she said. The practical exercise with night navigation. I need someone who can run the backup element while I run the primary. And I want your eyes on Huang. He's close to getting it, and he needs someone watching for the moment when he actually gets it, because that's when you push him to the next level. Huang. Got it. And Vasquez for CQB Advanced. He's ready for the dynamic evolution, and Stroud agrees, but we both think he needs another set of eyes before we certify him. What's the issue? Not an issue. He's technically clean. He's almost too clean. He's performing the procedure rather than running it. I want to see him make a genuine decision under pressure before I put advanced cert on his record. Rael looked at her sideways. You're harder on the good ones. The good ones can take it, she said. And they're the ones where the gap between good and excellent is actually closable. She paused. The average ones I can bring to standard. The good ones I can actually make better. That's where the work is. Your father would appreciate that logic. He taught it to me, she said. In April, Mercer submitted a formal proposal to the Facilities Oversight Committee for the creation of a permanent advanced instruction program, structured curriculum, tiered evaluation criteria, ongoing development framework. She cited the outcomes from the previous 3 rotations, improved qualification scores across every assessed metric, significant reduction in technique, related errors in post-exercise debriefs, and 2 specific incident outcomes, the demo range triage and a subsequent navigation exercise in February where a trainee's correct hasty casualty assessment had been directly credited to the supplemental curriculum. The proposal named Ava Carter as the program's founding instructor. Ava read the draft before it went up the chain, which Mercer had asked her to do. You put my name first, Ava said. It's your program. It's Stroud's syllabus and Rael's land navigation module and Boudin's revised evaluation criteria and Solis's trauma supplement. That you built, Mercer said. That came out of what you started. She held Ava's gaze. I know you're uncomfortable with the attribution. Do it anyway. Ava looked at the proposal, at her name at the top of the instructor section. There's a sentence in section 3, she said. Second paragraph. The thing about the facility's instructional philosophy, you're describing it as a shift toward experience-based methodology. That's accurate, but it frames it as a change from what existed before, which is going to create institutional resistance from the people who built what existed before. Mercer frowned. How would you frame it? As an addition, not a replacement. She handed the draft back with a page corner folded. The traditional methodology built the foundation. The advanced program builds on it. Same structure, different language, same result, much less resistance. Mercer looked at the paragraph. Then at Ava. You understand institutional politics better than you let on, she said. I understand that the goal is the trainees learning better, Ava said. Everything else is a means to that end, including the proposal language. Mercer revised the paragraph. The proposal went up the chain in the second week of April. It was approved in May. Ma'am. On the morning the approval came through, Rael found Ava in the east corridor. Not with a cart. She was just standing there, at the far end, looking at the length of it. The fluorescent lights and the scuffed concrete and the wall with the unit citations and the display mount that had started everything, still holding the same 4 rifles in the same positions. The approval, he said. I heard. How does it feel? She looked at the corridor, at the framed photographs, the motivational slogans with their peeling corners, at the floor she'd mopped 4 times a day during the wet season. Like the right thing took long enough, she said, and then happened. Rael stood beside her. What do you see when you look at it? He asked. She looked at the east corridor for a moment. The same floor, she said, and something different on top of it. She paused. Both are real. She turned and walked toward the training wing, the direction she always went now, the new direction. Rael stayed at the end of the corridor for a moment, looking at the display mount, at the rifles, at the laminated card on the Mark 12 that was, still, after all this time, perfectly straight. He went after her. The facility's spring graduation exercise. The event that capped each rotation, marking the transition of trainees to their next assignment, took place on a Friday morning in late May, on the parade ground, under a sky that was the clear, bright blue of a season actually arriving after a long winter. 26 trainees. Vasquez had earned his advanced cert in week 7, the moment Ava and Rael had both seen happen simultaneously during a dynamic CQB evolution. Not a performance, not technical cleanliness, a genuine decision made under pressure that proved he'd internalized the judgment rather than the procedure. Huang had run the night navigation practical in April and come in on bearing, his first time hitting it right, and Ava had said nothing during the exercise and everything in the debrief. Solis, who had completed her own rotation 3 months prior, had sent a message that morning. Watch Vasquez today. He's going to be an instructor himself in 5 years. The exercise ran for 4 hours. Ava ran the CQB evaluation with Rael. Stroud ran the weapons qualification. Boudin ran the navigation practical. The criteria were the revised ones, built over 2 evenings in December. At the end of it, Mercer stood at the front of the parade ground and addressed the rotation. She talked about the training they'd received and the gaps they'd close with experience and the things that couldn't be taught but could be modeled. And then she said something that Ava, standing to the side of the formation, didn't expect. The advanced instruction program that shaped this rotation, Mercer said, started because someone was willing to do something exceptional in a context that didn't ask for it, and keep doing it. And eventually the institution caught up to what was already there, she paused. That's a lesson in itself. Don't wait for the institution to recognize what you are. Be what you are. The recognition follows, or it doesn't, but who you are doesn't change based on whether anyone's looking. 26 trainees standing at attention. Ava looking at the parade ground. She thought about a Tuesday in November and a falling clipboard, and the way she'd caught it without looking up, and the long chain of things that had followed from that one ordinary motion. She thought about her father's hands, and his grip that had stayed strong longer than anyone expected, and the chair she'd brought from home in October. She thought about room 412, which now held a different patient, and would hold another after that, and another, the long procession of people moving through difficult time in the rooms of that building, and the people who sat beside them. She thought about the East Corridor, clean every morning, and about what her father had said at the end. Real warriors don't chase recognition. They do what's right and go home to the people they love. She understood it differently now than she had when he said it. At the time she'd heard it as comfort. Now she heard it as instruction. The last lesson from the best instructor she'd ever had, delivered not in a classroom but in a hospital bed, not to a student but to a daughter, which was the only context in which it could have landed the way it did. She went home that evening, not to the facility, not to the hospital, not to any of the places that had held her through the last year, to the apartment. Her things. The quiet of a space that was hers. She sat in the chair from room 412, which she'd brought home after. And she sat in the ordinary silence of an evening in late May, and she let herself be still. Not the trained stillness of someone managing their environment, but the real kind. The kind that doesn't cost anything. The kind that just is. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But tonight the work was done, and she was here. And that was enough. There are people in every room who are not what their badge says they are. Most of them are waiting for someone to ask the right question. The rest already know that it doesn't matter whether anyone asks, because what you carry regardless of whether it's seen, and the only question worth answering is what you do with it when the moment arrives. Ava Carter already knew the answer. She had always known. The strongest thing a person can do is remain exactly who they are, in every corridor, under every light, watched or unwatched, and trust that the work will speak when the time comes.